Somewhere beneath the North Atlantic, right now, there is a ship that nobody has visited in 80 years. She's sitting in roughly 3,000 meters of water, tilted at an angle, her hull slowly being consumed by salt and pressure and time. Her name is painted on a stern plate that is still, by some accident of deep ocean preservation, partially legible. She was a merchant vessel, a cargo ship carrying steel or oil or grain or aircraft parts, something that somebody on the other side of the ocean desperately needed. She was sunk, in most cases, in less than 5 minutes. She went down so fast that the men in the engine room never had time to reach the deck. She is one of more than 3,000 Allied merchant ships that the Second World War put on the ocean floor, and almost nobody remembers her name, and the water above her gives absolutely nothing away. That invisibility, that quality of the sea to simply close over and carry on, is the central problem of naval history. We remember the land battles because the land keeps its scars. You can walk the beaches of Normandy. You can stand in the ruins of Stalingrad, the hedgerows of the Bocage, and the streets of Monte Cassino, and the frozen ground outside Bastogne all carry in some physical form the echo of what happened there. The sea does not do that. The sea erases. And because the sea erases, the naval war of the Second World War has been consistently, persistently, and I would argue unforgivably underestimated in the popular imagination, treated as a backdrop to the real war rather than the foundation on which the real war was built. I want to fix that today. And I mean that seriously, not as a figure of speech, not as the kind of thing documentary introductions always promise and rarely deliver. Over the course of the next several hours, we are going to go through the complete naval history of the Second World War, from the first torpedo fired in September of 1939 to the surrender ceremony on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay in September of 1945. We're going to cover every major theater, every technological turning point, every catastrophic failure, and every hard-won success. We are going to do it with the specificity it deserves. And by the time we're done, I believe you'll understand the Second World War differently than you did when you started. Here is the argument I want you to hold in your mind through everything that follows. The Second World War was, at its most fundamental strategic level, a war about supply. It was a war about whether Britain could be kept fed and fueled and armed across an ocean. It was a war about whether the Soviet Union could receive enough tanks and food and aviation fuel to survive the German onslaught in its darkest years. It was a war about whether the United States could move its army, eventually more than 8 million soldiers, across 2 oceans and land them on the beaches of North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and a dozen Pacific islands, and keep them supplied once they were ashore. Every one of those things was a naval problem before it was anything else. The soldiers didn't invent the logistics that moved them. The airmen didn't fuel their own aircraft across the Atlantic. The politicians didn't personally organize the convoy routes. The Navy did those things, and whether those things succeeded or failed determined, more directly and more causally than almost anything that happened on land, whether the Allies were going to win. Churchill understood this. He wrote, not after the war, with the benefit of hindsight, but during it, that the only thing that ever truly frightened him in the entire war was the U-boat threat. Think about what that means. This was a man who had lived through the Blitz, who had stood on the roof of the cabinet war rooms while London burned, who had survived Dunkirk and Singapore and the fall of Tobruk and a dozen other military disasters that would have broken a lesser politician. He had faced the genuine possibility of German invasion in the summer of 1940. He had sat with casualty figures from North Africa and the Pacific that would have haunted a man with less iron in his spine. And through all of that, the thing that frightened him most was submarines in the Atlantic. He knew, as any strategist who thought clearly about supply lines had to know, that if the sea route failed, everything failed. You cannot fight a war with empty ports. Let me tell you what the scale of this conflict actually looked like, because numbers matter, and because the numbers of the naval war are staggering in a way that ought to stop you cold. The Battle of the Atlantic, a single campaign fought in a single ocean over roughly 5.5 years, involved more than 3,000 Allied merchant ships sent to the bottom, more than 36,000 Allied merchant sailors killed. These were not soldiers. They were not people who had trained for combat or signed up for military service. They were men whose job was to move cargo between continents. Ordinary working men from Liverpool and Halifax and Rotterdam and New York, who sailed back into the Atlantic after surviving one sinking because someone had to, and because the ships were sailing regardless. The Royal Canadian Navy, which began the war with 13 fighting ships and 3,500 men, grew to over 400 ships and 60,000 men to help protect those convoys. A transformation that has no peacetime parallel and receives approximately 2 paragraphs in most popular histories of the war. The German U-boat arm, the force that made the Atlantic so lethal, lost roughly 28,000 men out of approximately 40,000 who served. That is a 70% loss rate. No other branch of any military service on any side in this war came close to that number. In the Pacific, the numbers are, if anything, more extraordinary. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, the largest naval battle in history by any measurable standard, involved 218 Allied warships against 64 Japanese, fought across an area larger than the Korean peninsula over 4 days in an engagement so complex that it comprised 4 distinct sub-battles happening nearly simultaneously. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, displacing 72,000 tons and mounting 9 18-inch guns, was sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa in April of 1945, with only enough fuel to reach the target, and was sunk by carrier aircraft before she got there, taking nearly 2,700 men to the bottom. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had launched the Pacific War with 6 fleet carriers and the finest naval aviators in the world, ended it with no operational carrier force and no trained pilots left to fill the cockpits of the planes it still had. The entire Japanese strategic theory, the decisive fleet engagement that would force America to negotiate, was tested, found insufficient, and destroyed in 3.5 years of relentless American naval production. I need to be honest with you about something before we go any further. I'm not going to pretend this is a simple story with a clean moral geometry. The naval war of the Second World War was fought by human beings in conditions of extreme physical hardship and organizational chaos, making decisions with incomplete information, under time pressure, with institutional biases they often couldn't see clearly, and with the knowledge that being wrong was paid for in other people's lives. Some of those decisions were brilliant. Some were disastrous. Some were made by the same admiral in the same week. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by genius alone. It was won by a combination of technological development, industrial production, signals intelligence, operational innovation, and the grinding day-to-day effort of convoy escort groups in weather that was actively trying to kill them, regardless of whether any enemy appeared. The Pacific War was not won by carrier aviation alone. It was won by a logistical system of such complexity and ambition that it had no historical precedent, combined with a submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping that strangled Japan's war economy from the inside, while the surface campaign was attacking it from without. I'm also not going to pretend that the men on the other side were simply monsters. The young German sailors in the U-boats, many of them university graduates, drafted into a service that sent them to sea in vessels where the statistical probability of dying on any given patrol increased with every month of the war, were not the architects of the policy they served. Some of them were true believers. Many more were young men doing what their government required, in conditions of extraordinary physical danger, with a courage that their enemies, reading their captured diaries and after-action reports, frequently acknowledged. The Japanese sailors who died at Midway, at Philippines Sea, at Leyte Gulf, men who had been trained in a military culture that made retreat literally unthinkable, died in some of the most one-sided engagements in the history of naval warfare, not because they lacked courage, but because the industrial and technological balance had shifted beyond the point that courage alone could address. None of this is an apology for the wars their governments chose to fight. It is a recognition that history belongs to the people who lived it, not just to the causes they served. What you're going to get over the course of these 15 chapters is as complete an account of the naval war as I know how to make. We start at the beginning. September 1939, the state of the world's navies, what everybody had, what they thought they had, and the gap between those two things. We go through the first happy time, when the U-boats found that the Atlantic was theirs for the taking, and the long grinding years, when it wasn't clear that the convoy system could hold. We cover the Royal Navy's desperate juggling act across every ocean simultaneously. The Mediterranean, the Home Fleet, the Eastern Fleet, the Arctic. Fighting too many campaigns with too few ships that were aging in some places and wrong for the job in others. We cover Pearl Harbor with the specificity it deserves, not just as an attack, but as a strategic decision that reveals everything about Japan's understanding and fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy it was choosing. We cover Midway, which I will say plainly was the most consequential naval engagement of the 20th century. And I'll tell you exactly why, and show you the specific 4-minute window in which the outcome turned. We cover the island campaigns of the Pacific, the logistics that made them possible, and the human cost that was paid on beach after beach. We cover the Arctic Convoys, 36,000 kilometers of the most physically punishing waters on Earth, run again and again through darkness and ice and German air attack to keep the Soviet Union in the fight. We cover the Kamikaze campaign and what it genuinely looked like from the deck of a radar picket destroyer off Okinawa in the spring of 1945. And we finish with a full accounting, the cost in human life, the legacy in doctrine and technology and institutional inheritance, and a direct answer to the question of what the naval war decided that nothing else could have. I have tried to give you the history as it actually was, with the uncertainty and the confusion and the wrong turns and the genuine debates that historians still have about specific decisions and specific outcomes. Where there is documented dialogue, I'll use it. Where there is historiographical disagreement, I'll tell you there's disagreement and give you the strongest arguments on each side. Where the specific detail I want doesn't exist in the verified record, I'll tell you that instead of inventing something that sounds plausible, I am not interested in giving you a clean, smooth narrative where everything was inevitable and everyone knew what they were doing. That version of the war is a lie. The real version is harder and more interesting. I've been working on this for a long time. I've read the memoirs. Cunningham's A Sailor's Odyssey, the accounts of Atlantic convoy commanders, the post-war testimonies of U-boat crew members, the dispatches of destroyer captains who fought the Battle of Samar with escort carriers against battleships and somehow survived it. I've gone through the operational research literature, the mathematical analyses that proved, against naval tradition, that larger convoys were actually safer than smaller ones. I've worked through the intelligence history, the part that wasn't declassified until the 1970s. The part where you realize that routing decisions that look on the surface like brilliant seamanship were actually being driven by a cryptanalyst in Bletchley Park, reading German radio traffic and passing the results to a convoy routing officer in Liverpool. I've looked at the engineering, what a cavity magnetron actually does, and why it mattered that Britain shared the design with America in September of 1940, what the Long Lance torpedo's oxygen propulsion system meant for Japanese surface tactics, why the Mark 14 torpedo's defective exploder mechanism went unacknowledged for 18 months, while American submariners reported failure after failure that the Bureau of Ordnance attributed to poor technique. I've also read the personal accounts. The merchant sailor accounts in particular stay with me. The man who was torpedoed 3 times in 2 years and signed on for a 4th voyage. The officers of HMS Bulldog who boarded a sinking U-boat in May of 1941 and brought back cryptographic materials that changed the course of the Atlantic campaign. The crew of the escort carrier Gambier Bay, the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war, who were in the water off Samar while their destroyer escorts were still charging a Japanese battle line with guns blazing and torpedoes away. The radar picket destroyer crews off Okinawa, who were being struck by kamikazes at a rate that should have broken the willingness of any organization to continue staffing those stations, and who kept going back. Those people are the reason this documentary exists. The strategy is interesting. The technology is fascinating. The people are why it matters. A few things before we begin. This documentary is designed to be watched, but it works equally well as background listening. The kind of thing you put on in the evening and let run, following the story at whatever level of attention you have available. The pacing is deliberate. There are moments of intensity, the torpedo attack descriptions, the battle sequences, the kamikaze strikes, and there are longer stretches of strategic context and technological explanation. Both are necessary. You can't understand why Midway mattered if you don't understand what the carrier was and why it had displaced the battleship. You can't understand the Atlantic turning point of May 1943 if you don't understand the centimetric radar and the very long-range aircraft and the code breaking that preceded it. We have organized this into 15 chapters. Each covers a distinct phase or theater, and they run roughly chronologically, though the technology chapter, chapter 14, pulls back from the chronological structure to look at the full arc of the technical war across all theaters and all years. You can watch it straight through. You can use the chapter markers and jump to the theaters that interest you most. You can pause, come back, pick it up from where you left off. The history will still be there. It's been there for 80 years. A few more hours won't change it. If this is the kind of content you value, long form, researched specific, made by someone who has actually spent the time going through the primary and secondary sources, rather than paraphrasing a Wikipedia article over stock footage, then please subscribe if you haven't already. It takes significant time and effort to build something like this properly. And every subscriber tells the algorithm that there's an audience for serious history. Leave a comment below about which naval battle or campaign you think is most underrated in popular history. I have opinions on this question. I suspect you do too. I read every comment. I reply to a significant number of them. I enjoy the argument. For those of you who are already here, who have watched the previous histories in this series, who have been following along for months or years, thank you. You're the reason projects like this get finished now. The 2nd of September, 1939, 24 hours before Britain declared war on Germany, and on the North Atlantic, a German submarine is already in position. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Fleets That Would Fight. The State of the World's Navies in September 1939. There is a specific kind of arrogance that comes from having the largest navy in the world, and in September of 1939, the Royal Navy had it in some abundance. At the outbreak of war, Britain could field more than 15 battleships and battle cruisers, 7 aircraft carriers, 66 cruisers, 164 destroyers, and 66 submarines. The merchant fleet that those warships were theoretically protecting amounted to roughly a third of all merchant tonnage on Earth. When the British Admiralty looked at the map of the world's oceans, they saw something that resembled a proprietary network. A string of bases, coaling stations, dockyards, and strategic choke points, from Gibraltar to Singapore to Hong Kong to Halifax. They had been building this system for 200 years. They were confident in it in the way that only institutions with long memories of victory can be confident. And that confidence, as I'll say this plainly now, was going to cost them. The problem with measuring naval strength in 1939 is that the measurements everyone was using were already obsolete. The currency of naval power in that era was still largely denominated in battleships. Massive armoured surface vessels carrying guns of 14-inch to 16-inch caliber, designed to fight other battleships at ranges of up to roughly 30 kilometers. This was the doctrine that Alfred Thayer Mahan had articulated in the 1890s, and that almost every major naval power had organized itself around for the following 4 decades. Mahan's idea was elegant and felt like physics. Concentrate your battleships, seek out the enemy's battleships, destroy them, and you control the sea. Both the Royal Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained generations of officers on this doctrine. The United States Navy had done the same. What nobody had adequately reckoned with yet, not in institutional terms, not in the way that changes training programs and construction budgets, was the aircraft carrier. There were theorists who had made the argument. There were aviators, particularly in the American and Japanese navies, who believed it with genuine conviction. But the admirals who had risen to senior command had risen through the battleship world, and the battleship world was what they understood. The carrier was still, in 1939, a technology waiting for a catastrophe to prove its case. Germany entered the war with a navy that was, by comparison to Britain's, modest in surface strength. The Kriegsmarine had 4 capital ships, the 2 Scharnhorst-class battlecruisers, and 2 more powerful ships still either building or newly completed, 12 cruisers, 17 destroyers, and, critically, 57 operational U-boats at the start of hostilities, though not all of those were ocean-going vessels suited for Atlantic operations. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commanding the Kriegsmarine, understood perfectly well that he could not challenge the Royal Navy in a conventional surface engagement. He had a Plan Z, an ambitious building program intended to give Germany a balanced, powerful fleet by 1948. But Plan Z was still years from fruition when the war came early. Raeder was not a reckless man. He had given Hitler a frank assessment. The surface navy could harass and cause disruption, but it could not fight for control of the sea. The U-boats, commanded by Karl Dönitz, were a different matter. Dönitz believed in them with a fervour that was almost theological. He had served in submarines in the First World War. He understood that the submarine was not a weapon of fleet engagement. It was a weapon of attrition, designed to strangle an island nation's supply lines. And in that role, if deployed in sufficient numbers and with proper tactical coordination, he believed it could win the war outright. He asked Hitler for 300 ocean-going submarines. He got 57. That gap between what Dönitz asked for and what he received is actually one of the most consequential procurement failures in the history of naval warfare. though it would take years before the Allies could afford to be relieved about it. I want to take a moment here to talk about Italy, because the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, tends to get undervalued in popular accounts of the naval war. And I think that's unfair to both the ships and the men who served aboard them. When Italy entered the war on the 10th of June 1940, the Regia Marina could field 6 battleships, 19 cruisers, 59 destroyers, 67 torpedo boats, and 116 submarines. That is a substantial force. Italy had no aircraft carriers. 2 were under construction and were never launched, and the nation's industrial capacity wasn't strong enough to sustain major losses and rebuild simultaneously, which made the senior Italian commanders genuinely cautious about committing their fleet to engagements where they might lose ships they couldn't replace. The British, for their part, had broken the Italian naval code early in the war, which meant they often knew the routing, timing, and composition of Italian convoys before those convoys left port. That is a crippling disadvantage, and it goes a long way toward explaining what otherwise look like puzzling Italian operational failures. Japan's navy, on the 7th of December 1941, was the instrument of one of the most audacious single operations in the history of sea power. But I want to give you the baseline before we get to Pearl Harbor. At the moment of Japan entering the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy could field 10 battleships, 6 fleet aircraft carriers, 4 light carriers, 18 heavy cruisers, 18 light cruisers, 113 destroyers, and 63 submarines. The frontline naval air arm consisted of 1,753 warplanes, including 660 fighters and 330 torpedo bombers. The pilots of that carrier force were, at that moment, probably the most skilled and experienced naval aviators in the world. They had been flying combat operations in China. They had logged thousands of carrier hours. The Japanese Zero fighter had a longer range and better performance than any American carrier aircraft in late 1941. Japan went to war at the absolute peak of its naval relative strength, and the tragedy, if you can use that word about a navy that struck first, is that it was never going to get better. The industrial gap between Japan and the United States was roughly 10 to 1. Japan could be brilliant. Japan could not be inexhaustible. That asymmetry was always there, waiting. The United States Navy in late 1941 was powerful, growing rapidly, and organized around a doctrine that was already partly obsolete before the year was out. The fleet had 8 aircraft carriers, 4,500 pilots, and approximately 3,400 carrier aircraft. It had 17 battleships, the pride of the Pacific Fleet, concentrated at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The American war plan, designated Rainbow 5, assumed a Europe-first strategy and anticipated cooperation with Britain and France. It was a sensible plan as far as it went. What it did not adequately account for was the possibility that Japan would strike first, at the heart of American Pacific power, with such speed and precision that the entire assumed strategic baseline would be invalid by breakfast time. I find myself, when I study the pre-war American naval posture, thinking about the particular vulnerability of concentrated strength. Everything the battleship admirals valued, the Mahanian dream of the decisive fleet engagement, required having your fleet intact and available. Pearl Harbor was going to demonstrate, in the most violent possible way, what happens when concentrated strength meets concentrated audacity. The Soviet Navy, at the start of the conflict, was the least developed of the major naval powers, and there are several reasons for that, beyond simple industrial capacity. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had devastated the officer corps of all Soviet services, but the Navy suffered particularly badly. Senior naval officers who had developed doctrine, who understood modern submarine and aviation tactics, who had spent careers thinking about fleet operations. Many of them were gone, arrested or executed during the purge years. The naval share of the Soviet national munitions budget actually fell from 11.5% in 1941 to 6.5% by 1944, as the catastrophic land war on the Eastern Front consumed everything the Soviet economy could produce. The Soviet Navy would perform credibly in coastal defense operations, particularly around Odessa, Sevastopol, and Stalingrad, where naval artillery and naval infantry made real contributions. But it was never going to be a significant open ocean force. The Soviets' most important naval role in the war was as recipients, the beneficiaries of the Allied convoy system that ran through the Arctic to Murmansk and Archangel. The French Navy, the Marine Nationale, deserves a particular mention here because its fate was so strange and so painful. When France fell in June of 1940, it had the fourth largest navy in the world. Germany, under the armistice terms, allowed the Vichy government to retain its warships rather than handing them to the Kriegsmarine, which was a decision that made a certain tactical sense from the German perspective, since incorporating French ships would have required German crews who didn't exist. The ships were sent to French colonial ports or to ports under British control. What followed was one of the most tragic episodes in Allied naval history. On the 3rd of July 1940, the British attacked the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir, near Oran on the Algerian coast. 1,300 French sailors were killed. 3 of the 4 battleships at anchor were sunk or badly damaged. Churchill ordered the attack because he genuinely feared the French fleet falling into German hands. The Vichy government was furious. It maintained armed neutrality, but did not retaliate. The ships that remained eventually assembled at Toulon, amounting to some 200,000 tons of warships, would have a final dark chapter of their own when Germany occupied all of France in November 1942 and tried to seize them. The French officers, rather than hand them over, scuttled their entire fleet at anchor. What 1939 tells us, if we're honest about it, is that the world went to war with a naval doctrine built for the previous century. The battleship wasn't dead. It would still find important uses, particularly in shore bombardment, but the carrier and the submarine were the weapons that were going to determine the outcome. Neither side had fully accepted this yet. The British were stretched across every ocean with a fleet that was aging in places and short on everything from modern carriers to adequate anti-submarine escorts. Germany was fighting a naval war with a fraction of the U-boat fleet its own submarine commander believed was necessary. Japan was at its peak and knew, at some level, that time was not its friend. America was powerful and partly asleep. And out on the Atlantic, before any of the famous battles had been fought, before Pearl Harbor, before Midway, before Leyte Gulf, the killing had already started. A German U-boat, on the very first day of the war, sank a British passenger liner called the Athenia, with more than 1,000 civilians aboard. 117 of them died. The naval war didn't wait for anyone to be ready. I want to sit with that for a moment before we move on. The Athenia was struck on the 3rd of September, 1939. The same day, Britain declared war. The U-boat commander who fired the torpedo, Oberleutnant Fitzjulius Lemp, reportedly believed he was attacking a British armed merchant cruiser. He was wrong. When he realized what he'd done, he ordered his crew to silence about it, and the German government initially denied any involvement, falsely claiming the British had sunk their own ship as a provocation. The truth came out eventually, as it tends to. But what strikes me about the Athenia is not the German deception or even the tragedy of the dead. It's the speed. Hours. The ink was barely dry on the declaration of war, and the sea had already begun collecting its toll. 6 years of that lay ahead. 6 years. Understanding how that war was fought, won, and at what cost. That is what we're here to do. Chapter 2. The first happy time. U-boats, wolf packs, and the opening battle of the Atlantic. 1939 to 1941. There is a phrase that the U-boat crews themselves used to describe the period between the outbreak of war and roughly the spring of 1941. They called it die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. I have always found that phrase unsettling, not because it was inaccurate from their perspective, but because of what it reveals about the asymmetry of war. For Allied merchant sailors during those same months, men in oil-soaked water, men waiting for a rescue that sometimes never came, men watching their ships go down in the North Atlantic in weather so cold that survival time in the water was measured in minutes. It was not a happy time by any available measure. Language, I keep finding, is where the moral weight of a war first goes quiet. To understand what the U-boats were able to accomplish in those early months, you have to understand the tactical situation they inherited. Germany had 57 operational submarines at the outbreak of war, but not all of these were suitable for extended Atlantic operations. The small coastal Type 2 boats, for instance, were short-ranged and largely confined to operations in the North Sea and around the British Isles. The ocean-capable Type 7 boats, which would become the backbone of the campaign, numbered far fewer in the early period. Dönitz was working with a constrained hand, and he knew it. Nevertheless, the results in the first months of the war were significant enough to alarm the British Admiralty immediately. German submarines sank 53 merchant ships in the final 3 months of 1939 alone. The convoy system, which Britain had learned at enormous cost in the First World War, was the essential defensive measure against submarine attack, was reintroduced from the very first week of hostilities. Convoys reduced the number of ships available as individual targets, but convoys moved slowly, could not use the fastest direct routes, and created massive bottlenecks at both ends of the crossing. The fall of France in June 1940 changed the entire strategic geometry of the U-boat campaign, and this point is underappreciated in casual accounts of the war. Before France fell, German submarines had to sortie from ports in Germany and navigate the long way around Scotland and through the North Atlantic approaches to reach their patrol areas. It was slow, it consumed fuel, and it reduced the time boats could spend on station. After France fell, Germany occupied the Atlantic coast ports: Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Bordeaux. These were deep water, fully equipped ports that put the U-boats hundreds of kilometers closer to the Atlantic convoy routes. The operational time on station dramatically increased. Dönitz moved his headquarters to France, and the tempo of sinkings rose accordingly. In June of 1941 alone, a single month, German U-boats sank Allied shipping, totaling 454,000 tons. Let me say that again, because that number requires a moment. 454,000 tons. In 1 month, merchant ships were being sent to the bottom, faster than Allied shipyards could build new ones. The arithmetic of the campaign was moving against Britain. Dönitz had a tactical innovation that made his limited force far more effective than its numbers should have permitted. He called it the Rudel tactic, the wolf pack. The idea was straightforward. Rather than deploying individual submarines to hunt independently, spread them out in patrol lines across convoy routes. And when one boat found a convoy, it would radio its position and wait while others converged. The attack would then be made at night, on the surface, from multiple angles, simultaneously, saturating the convoy escorts and making coordinated defense nearly impossible. Surface attacks at night were particularly dangerous for the escorts because their ASDIC sonar, a British underwater detection system, that worked by emitting pulls of sound and listening for reflections, was effective against a submerged submarine, but nearly useless against a U-boat running on the surface. An attacking U-boat at night was nearly invisible and nearly as fast as a destroyer. The Wolfpack reduced the convoy system's defensive advantage and made every Atlantic crossing a gamble with serious odds. I want to make sure I'm being honest about the British response, because the early months were not simply a story of German success and British helplessness. The Royal Navy entered the war with a clear institutional understanding of the convoy requirement, which gave it a significant head start compared to 1917. Anti-submarine hunting groups were deployed from the first weeks. ASDIC, developed in the interwar years, was fitted across the destroyer and sloop fleet and provided a genuine detection capability against submerged U-boats. The problem in 1939 and 1940 wasn't ignorance, it was capacity. There simply weren't enough escorts to protect the volume of shipping that had to cross the Atlantic, and the ones that existed were stretched across multiple commitments. Protecting the Norwegian campaign, covering Dunkirk, guarding against the threatened invasion of Britain, anti-submarine warfare was competing with every other naval priority simultaneously, and it was doing so against an enemy that was improving its tactics, shifting its patrol areas, and adding new boats to the front line on a regular basis. The British destroyed 24 U-boats in 1940. That's not nothing. But German yards were launching new boats faster than they were being sunk. The entry of the United States into the pre-war naval situation in the Atlantic deserves specific attention here, because the American contribution began before Pearl Harbor and before any formal declaration of war. President Roosevelt, deeply committed to keeping Britain in the fight, found ways to push American naval involvement to the limit of what neutrality law could plausibly sustain. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement of September 1940 transferred 50 older American destroyers to the Royal Navy in exchange for basing rights across British territories in the Western Hemisphere. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 allowed military materiel to be sent to Britain without immediate cash payment. American warships began escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic, technically as far as Iceland, which the United States had occupied in July 1941. American destroyers exchanged fire with U-boats months before Pearl Harbor technically put the two nations at war. The USS Greer was attacked in September 1941. The USS Kearney was torpedoed and damaged in October. The USS Reuben James was sunk on the 31st of October 1941 with the loss of 115 men. The first American warship sunk in what was, officially, still a period of American neutrality. Roosevelt had walked the country to the edge of war through a series of steps that each seemed individually defensible and cumulatively amounted to active belligerence. Then Pearl Harbor made the question moot. What happened to American coastal shipping after Pearl Harbor is one of the more painful chapters in the entire Atlantic campaign. And I find it genuinely difficult to understand without concluding that somebody made a serious institutional mistake. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the American eastern seaboard, from Maine to Florida, became a new hunting ground for German submarines. Dönitz called the Operation Paukenschlag, drummer beat. He sent a small initial force of 5 Type Nikes long-range boats against the American coast, and the results were extraordinary. American coastal cities were still lit up at night, and the silhouettes of merchant ships could be clearly seen against the glow of those lights from offshore. The convoy system, which again the British had learned was essential, had not yet been implemented for American coastal traffic. Ships moved independently, without escorts, on a predictable coastline route. The U-boats found this situation almost incomprehensibly favorable. Between January and July of 1942, nearly 400 Allied ships were sunk in American coastal waters in the Caribbean, while only 7 U-boats were destroyed. The British, who had been fighting this campaign for 2 years, sent explicit advice about the necessity of convoys. That advice was not immediately acted upon. The American Navy's senior leadership, particularly Admiral Ernest King, was resistant to implementing coastal convoys, partly on the grounds that if you couldn't do it properly, you shouldn't do it at all, meaning that poorly escorted convoys might be worse than no convoys. The British disagreed sharply with this assessment, and history has sided with the British. The technological contest running beneath the tactical surface of the Battle of the Atlantic is something I want to keep returning to throughout these chapters, because it's where the real story of why the Allies eventually won lives. In 1940 and early 1941, German U-boats were benefiting from a specific intelligence advantage. They were reading the British naval cipher, not fully, not instantly, but sufficiently to allow German signals intelligence to improve convoy routing toward patrols. The British, for their part, had built Bletchley Park and were working on the German Enigma cipher machines, with a desperation born of watching ships go down by the hundreds. The intelligence war was not one-sided, but the shifting of advantages, the occasional blackouts when codes were changed, the periodic periods when one side or the other was reading the other's traffic. All of this directly determined convoy routing and directly determined survival rates. This is the point where naval history and intelligence history are genuinely the same subject, and anyone who tries to tell you the Battle of the Atlantic without talking about signals intelligence is only giving you half the picture. The human experience of the Atlantic crossing in this period is something no set of tonnage statistics adequately conveys. Merchant sailors were not combatants in the legal sense of the word. Most of them had no military training, carried no weapons individually, and had no means of defending themselves if their ship was struck. A torpedo hit on a fully laden tanker could mean an explosion of burning oil spreading across the water. A hit on a cargo ship could mean the vessel going down in less than 5 minutes. Not enough time to launch lifeboats in any organized way, even in calm conditions. The North Atlantic in winter is not calm. The water temperature in the North Atlantic in winter is cold enough that a person without a survival suit will lose consciousness in the water within about 15 minutes and will die within roughly an hour. The men who survived sinkings often survived because they were lucky enough to be close to a lifeboat or a piece of wreckage, in conditions where luck was the primary variable. Canada's merchant navy casualty rate, 1 sailor in 7 killed or wounded, was higher proportionally than any of Canada's fighting services. 1 in 7. Think about that in terms of any group you know well. The first happy time ended not through any single breakthrough, but through a combination of factors that accumulated pressure on the U-boat campaign from multiple directions simultaneously. The extension of convoy routes, the gradual improvement in escort numbers as new construction came online, better ASDIC training, increased use of maritime patrol aircraft, and growing intelligence successes against the German cipher all began to narrow the gap. By the spring of 1941, the loss rate had come down from its catastrophic peak, though it remained brutally high. Dönitz responded by shifting his patrol areas, pushing further west into the mid-Atlantic air gap where Allied aircraft couldn't reach, searching for the space between one technological solution and the next. The battle wasn't over. It had barely begun. But the first phase, the phase where a small number of German submarines nearly broke the Atlantic supply line through a combination of tactical skill and Allied unpreparedness, that phase was closing. What came next was going to be harder for everyone. Chapter 3. Steel and sacrifice. The Royal Navy's war in European waters, 1940 to 1942. There's a line that the German General Alfred Jodl used when discussing the possibility of invading Britain in 1940. He said that attempting a crossing of the English Channel against the Royal Navy would be like sending his troops into a mincing machine. I have always appreciated the candor of that assessment, partly because it came from someone who was not, by any reasonable characterization, easily intimidated, and and partly because it tells you something real about what the Royal Navy represented, even in its worst year. 1940 was genuinely a terrible year for British sea power. The Norway campaign had been a disaster. Dunkirk had been a miracle that cost 7,000 Royal Navy men their lives. The loss of the carrier Glorious to German battlecruisers was a serious blow. And yet the fleet remained coherent, remained operational, remained sufficient to make invasion genuinely untenable. That's the naval war in a compressed form. The British took serious damage and kept going. The Norway campaign of April 1940 is worth examining in some detail because it tends to get compressed into a footnote about Chamberlain's political downfall, and the naval dimensions is more significant than it usually receives credit for. Germany invaded Norway on the 9th of April 1940 in an operation, Weserübung, that required enormous naval coordination and enormous risk. German surface ships transported troops to multiple Norwegian ports simultaneously. The Royal Navy and the Norwegian Navy were caught off balance by the speed and ambition of the German operation. And in the first days, the German landings succeeded despite British naval presence in the area. But the Kriegsmarine paid a heavy price. In the Norwegian campaign, Germany lost the heavy cruiser Blücher, sunk by Norwegian coastal artillery and torpedo batteries in the Oslo fjord, which was a historically significant moment. A shore-based defense actually stopping a major warship, along with 2 light cruisers and 10 destroyers. These weren't replacement-level losses for a navy that started with 12 cruisers and 17 destroyers. The British did succeed in evacuating more than 300,000 Allied personnel from Norway, France, and the Low Countries over the following weeks, losing an aircraft carrier and 6 destroyers in the process. The numbers tell a story of a navy operating at the absolute limits of its capacity and managing, just barely, to keep the situation from becoming catastrophic. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940, is remembered primarily as a land story, or an RAF story, or a story of little boats. The Royal Navy element is frequently understated. The Navy organized and executed the evacuation of more than 338,000 Allied soldiers from beaches under air and artillery attack, losing 6 destroyers sunk and 19 more badly damaged. 7,000 Royal Navy personnel were killed during the operation. The ships ran back and forth across a channel that was being contested from the air, in conditions of organizational chaos on the beaches, during weather that varied from brutal to merely terrible. I think about Dunkirk and naval history together, and what I keep coming back to is the role of institutional steadiness. The Royal Navy knew how to move ships, how to organize a complicated maritime operation under pressure, how to keep going when things were going wrong. That institutional capacity, built over generations, was not glamorous, and it wasn't easily described, but it was exactly what Dunkirk required. The hunt for the Bismarck in May 1941 is one of the most famous episodes of the entire naval war, and I want to be careful with it because it has acquired a kind of mythological sheen that sits uneasily on top of what was actually a very painful series of events for the Royal Navy. The Bismarck was Germany's newest and largest battleship, roughly 50,000 tons, fully loaded, mounting 8 15-inch guns, with modern fire control and exceptional armor. She sailed with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen for the Atlantic, with the intention of attacking Allied convoys. On the 24th of May 1941, she encountered the British battlecruiser HMS Hood and the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales in the Denmark Strait. The Hood was arguably the most famous warship in the Royal Navy. She had been the symbol of British sea power for 2 decades. The ship sent on imperial visits, the ship whose silhouette every British schoolchild knew. She was also, by 1941, old, and her deck armour was inadequate against plunging fire at long range. After a short engagement of approximately 8 minutes, a shell from Bismarck penetrated Hood's magazine. There was a catastrophic explosion. HMS Hood sank in under 3 minutes, taking 1,415 men with her. 3 survived. The Prince of Wales took hits and was forced to withdraw. The shock to British national morale was enormous. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in naval history. And I use that word advisedly because it really was a hunt. Dozens of ships, multiple aircraft squadrons, and an intelligence network all converging on a single ship over several days. The Bismarck was damaged during the Denmark Strait engagement and was heading for the French port of Saint-Nazaire for repairs. A swordfish torpedo bomber from HMS Victorious scored 1 hit during a night attack without stopping her. Then, on the 25th of May, contact was lost. The Admiralty was genuinely alarmed. If Bismarck reached port, she would be repaired and could sortie again. The hunt was called off in some areas. Then, on the 26th of May, a Catalina flying boat of Coastal Command, an American-built aircraft, flown partly by an American naval officer who was present in an unofficial capacity before American entry into the war, relocated the Bismarck. Swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Ark Royal attacked in fading evening light. 2 torpedoes hit, and 1, critically, jammed Bismarck's rudder, leaving her unable to steer a straight course. She was circling. Battleships Rodney and King George V came up the following morning and engaged her at close range. After a protracted engagement in which Bismarck was reduced to a burning wreck, but continued to float, she was finally sunk by torpedoes from the cruiser Dorsetshire. There is a still unresolved historiographical question about whether the German crew scuttled her before the British torpedoes found her flooding compartments. The German survivors maintained they opened the seacocks themselves. The British denied the ship was going down on her own. Both things may have contributed. 2,096 German sailors died. 114 survived. The Mediterranean naval war was playing out simultaneously with everything else, and it deserves proper treatment rather than being folded into a sentence. Britain's Mediterranean fleet, based at Alexandria under Admiral Andrew Cunningham, was operating in one of the most contested stretches of water in the world, simultaneously protecting convoys to Malta, intercepting Axis supply routes to North Africa, covering evacuations from Greece and Crete, and fighting a sustained campaign against the Italian Regia Marina. Cunningham was, by almost universal assessment, one of the finest fleet commanders of the war. Aggressive, clear-headed, and willing to take the kind of calculated risks that produced decisive results. In November 1940, swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Illustrious attacked the Italian fleet at its base in Taranto harbour. In a single night operation, 3 Italian battleships were put out of action for varying periods. The operation cost 2 British aircraft. It was the first successful attack by carrier aircraft on a defended fleet in harbour. Japanese naval attachés in Rome studied the Taranto operation carefully. The planning for Pearl Harbor, more than a year later, incorporated what they learned. The loss of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya on the 10th of December 1941. 3 days after Pearl Harbor completed a particularly dark week for Allied naval power and deserves its own extended treatment, which we'll return to in a later chapter on the Far East. But I want to flag it here because it happened within the sequence of European naval events. 2 days after Pearl Harbor, the first operational deployment of capital ships to the Far East ended in catastrophe when both ships were sunk by Japanese land-based torpedo bombers. There were no Allied aircraft carriers nearby to provide air cover. The ships had modern anti-aircraft armament, but it was not enough against coordinated low-level torpedo attack in sufficient numbers. 840 men died. Churchill wrote afterward that he was physically sick with the news. It confirmed what the carrier admirals had been arguing for years. A surface warship without air cover, operating within range of enemy land-based aircraft, was simply a target. The battleship era was not over, not by a long way. But its limitations had been demonstrated twice in a week in 2 different oceans, and nobody who was paying attention could ignore it any longer. The Royal Navy's operational commitments by the end of 1941 stretched across every meaningful body of water on Earth. The home fleet in Scapa Flow guarded against German surface breakouts into the Atlantic. The Mediterranean fleet contested the Middle Sea against Italy, and increasingly, German air power. The Eastern Fleet maintained a presence in the Indian Ocean. The Arctic Convoy route to the Soviet Union was opening. Escort groups for the Atlantic were perpetually undermanned. Force Z, Prince of Wales and Repulse, had just been lost. Through all of this, the Royal Navy was also losing men at a rate that didn't receive the public attention it deserved. By the end of the war, 51,000 Royal Navy sailors had been killed. 30,000 more from the merchant services. The numbers were real, and they accumulated gradually, ship by ship, watch by watch, in waters from the Barents Sea to the Coral Sea. The Royal Navy fought in every theatre of the war. That is not an exaggeration. It is a simple fact. What 1940 and 1941 demonstrated about the Royal Navy was something that I think gets lost in the larger narrative of Britain's imperial decline. The Navy was stretched, aging in parts, repeatedly surprised by the pace of technological change, operating under a First Sea Lord whose judgment has been debated ever since. It lost ships it could ill afford to lose. It made operational decisions that historians still argue about. The dispersal of Convoy PQ-17, the relief of Admiral North, the handling of the Norwegian campaign. And yet it kept going. It evacuated armies. It protected supply lines. It interdicted Axis resupply of North Africa. It launched carrier strikes that changed the calculus of naval warfare. It maintained the coherence of the Allied convoy system under sustained attack. Jodl's mincing machine metaphor was right. The Royal Navy of 1940 to 1942 was battered, overstretched, and absolutely essential. Chapter 4. Day of Infamy. Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War begins. December 1941. I've been to Pearl Harbor. I stood on the memorial above the USS Arizona, looking down at the oil that still seeps up from her hull. They call it the Arizona's Tears. And I tried to hold in my mind simultaneously the historical event and the fact that the ship is still there, below me, with over 1,100 men still inside her. I'm not sure those two things fully come together. The historical event is something I can analyze. The carrier strike force, the approach route, the sequence of attacks, the targeting priorities, the intelligence failures on the American side, the operational planning on the Japanese side, the fact that the ship is still there, still leaking, still carrying its dead. That part resists analysis. It just sits there beneath the surface, like the ship itself. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor grew out of a strategic crisis that Japan had been moving toward for years. The Japanese military expansion into China, beginning in earnest in 1937, had produced a steady deterioration in relations with the United States. American oil exports to Japan, which, along with Dutch East Indies oil, supplied roughly 90% of Japan's aviation fuel and naval bunker oil, were progressively restricted through 1940 and 1941 as the United States attempted to pressure Japan into withdrawing from China. When Japan moved into southern French Indochina in July 1941, expanding toward the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the Roosevelt administration froze Japanese assets in the United States and implemented a comprehensive oil embargo. Japan had strategic fuel reserves sufficient for perhaps 1 to 2 years of full military operations. After that, without new oil sources, the aircraft would stop flying and the ships would stop moving. The choice, as Japan's military leadership framed it, was between strategic capitulation, abandoning the Chinese campaign, withdrawing from Indochina, accepting American terms, or seizing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya by force. The second option necessarily meant war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, commanding the combined fleet, had been to America. He knew American industrial capacity. He told his government, in terms that were as direct as a senior Japanese officer could be with his political leadership, that if Japan went to war with the United States, he could promise sensational results for perhaps a year or 18 months. But he could guarantee nothing after that. His advice was not followed. Yamamoto's plan for neutralizing the American Pacific Fleet was conceptually brilliant and carries a residual fascination that I think is worth being careful about, because brilliance in military planning is not a moral category. The idea was to use Japan's carrier force, specifically 6 fleet carriers, the finest concentration of naval air power in the world at that moment, to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, where the American battle fleet was based. The American battleships would be sunk at their moorings. The Pacific Fleet would be, in theory, neutralized for 6 months to a year, while Japan consolidated its seizure of the southern resource area. During that time, Japan hoped to establish a defensive perimeter, from the Kurils through Wake and the Marshalls to the Bismarcks and the Dutch East Indies, and back through Malaya, so formidable that the Americans would eventually accept a negotiated peace rather than pay the cost of reducing it. It was a plan that rested on a single, catastrophic assumption: that the United States, once struck hard enough and forced into a protracted campaign across a vast ocean, would choose accommodation over retribution. This assumption was wrong. It was wrong in a way that arguably doomed the plan before the first aircraft left the deck. The strike force, designated Kido Butai, the mobile force, departed the Kuril Islands in the far north of Japan on the 26th of November 1941 under strict radio silence, maintaining a course that kept it well north of established shipping lanes. It consisted of 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. With them came 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers for refueling at sea. The last being a logistical requirement that reflects careful planning. The force maintained complete radio silence for the entire approach. American intelligence, which had broken significant portions of Japanese diplomatic cipher traffic, was reading the political signals clearly. War was coming, but the precise location of the carrier force was unknown. American commanders in Hawaii were warned in late November that negotiations had failed and that Japanese military action was expected somewhere in the Pacific imminently. The warning did not specify Pearl Harbor. It stressed the Philippines and Southeast Asia as the likely targets. This assessment, combined with the assumption that an attack on Hawaii, roughly 3,300 nautical miles from Japan, was beyond Japanese operational reach, left the fleet at Pearl Harbor in a condition of elevated but unfocused alertness rather than genuine preparation. The attack came on the 7th of December, 1941, just before 8 in the morning, local time. The first wave, 183 aircraft, arrived at 0753. The second wave, 170 aircraft, followed approximately 50 minutes later. 8 battleships were at their moorings along Battleship Row on Ford Island. 4 were sunk, 4 more were damaged. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and a number of smaller vessels were sunk or damaged. The United States lost 188 aircraft, destroyed on the ground and runway, with another 159 damaged. 2,403 Americans were killed. 1,178 were wounded. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 64 men. By any accounting of assets exchanged, it was a lopsided Japanese success. And yet, and this is the operational counterargument that has been made consistently by naval historians since the war, the attack failed to hit what mattered most. The 3 American aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet were not at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was en route to Midway. Saratoga was undergoing refit on the American West Coast. They were not at their home port for entirely routine reasons on the day Japan came to destroy them. This was not brilliant American foresight. It was coincidence. But the consequence of that coincidence was that the weapon system that was actually going to determine the outcome of the Pacific Naval War, the carrier, was intact. The Japanese had, with great precision and courage and operational skill, destroyed 8 battleships that the war was about to render strategically secondary, while leaving untouched the carriers that were about to become primary. Yamamoto, according to multiple accounts, understood this immediately. The attack, he reportedly said, had awakened a sleeping giant. Whether those exact words were spoken or are a later construction is a matter of historiographical debate. I won't pretend the attribution is unimpeachable, but the sentiment accurately reflects what he had reason to believe. The diplomatic and political aftermath of Pearl Harbor collapsed the constraints that had been limiting American military commitment. Congress declared war on Japan on the 8th of December with a single dissenting vote. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States on the 11th of December, a decision that remains one of the harder to explain strategic choices of the war. Hitler was not required to do this under the terms of the Tripartite Pact, which obligated Germany to assist Japan only if Japan was attacked, not if Japan was the aggressor. His declaration transformed an undeclared naval war in the Atlantic into a formal state of belligerence and allowed Roosevelt to implement the Europe First strategy that American military planning had always favored. If Hitler had stayed out, the American public, freshly outraged by Pearl Harbor and wanting Japanese blood specifically, might have been far harder to redirect toward a Europe First approach. Hitler's declaration was, by almost any analysis, a gift to American grand strategy. The immediate Japanese operations after Pearl Harbor demonstrated the breadth and ambition of their strategic plan. In the weeks following the 7th of December, Japanese forces simultaneously attacked the Philippines, Malaya, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. Wake Island fell on the 23rd of December after a memorable defense by a small marine garrison. The island's defenders actually repelled an initial Japanese landing force before being overwhelmed by a second, larger assault. Guam fell on the 10th of December. The Philippines were invaded at multiple points. Manila was declared an open city and abandoned in early January. The American and Filipino forces retreated into the Bataan Peninsula and eventually Corregidor in a last-ditch defense that lasted until May of 1942. Japan captured Singapore, Britain's great fortress in Asia, the supposed Gibraltar of the East. On the 15th of February, 1942, when the British commander, General Percival, surrendered more than 80,000 men, the largest surrender in British military history. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Battle of the Java Sea at the end of February and beginning of March 1942 was the naval engagement that effectively ended organized Allied resistance in Southeast Asian waters. The combined striking force, American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships under the Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, was sent to intercept a Japanese invasion convoy heading for Java. What followed was a 7-hour running battle in which Doorman launched attack after attack against the convoy's escort, was repulsed each time, lost ship after ship to Japanese gunfire and the extraordinarily effective Japanese Long Lance torpedo, and finally went down with his flagship, De Ruyter, at the end of the action. 1,000 Dutch sailors died with him. In the following days, the surviving Allied ships were hunted down and sunk one by one as they attempted to escape through the Sunda Strait or the Lombok Strait. The Dutch Navy in the Far East was, for practical purposes, annihilated. Java surrendered on the 8th of March, in roughly 90 days from Pearl Harbor. Japan had conquered an area stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific, a domain larger than Europe. I want to pull back from the speed of those events and make an observation that I think gets lost when you're moving through them chronologically. The rapidity of Japanese success in those first 90 days was genuinely shocking to Allied governments, to Allied publics, and to the Allied military commanders who had to absorb defeat after defeat with almost no victories to offer in return. There was a real question in the spring of 1942 about whether the tide could be turned at all, about whether Japan's perimeter could be cracked, about whether the United States could produce ships and aircraft and trained pilots faster than Japan could consolidate its gains. The answer to those questions was yes, but that was not obvious at the time. It required an industrial mobilization of a scale that had no precedent in American history, and it required a battle in June of 1942 that would begin to answer the question of whether Japanese naval power could be stopped. That battle was at a place called Midway, and it is the subject of our next chapter, Chapter 5, 4 Minutes, that changed the Pacific. The Battle of Midway, June 1942. There is a moment in the Battle of Midway, a specific documented, approximately 4-minute window between roughly 10:22 and 10:26 in the morning on the 4th of June 1942, in which the entire course of the Pacific War changed. That isn't rhetoric. It's almost literally true. In those few minutes, American dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise struck the Japanese fleet carriers Kaga and Akagi in near-simultaneous attacks. Within minutes, dive bombers from Yorktown struck Soryu. All 3 carriers were burning. A 4th, Hiryu, would be found and struck later the same day. Japan had arrived at Midway with 4 fleet carriers, and it was leaving with 0. Military historian John Keegan called the result the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. I don't think he was overstating it. The question is how it happened, because the gap between what should have happened, a Japanese victory by almost any pre-battle analysis, and what actually happened is one of the most instructive stories in all of military history. Yamamoto's plan for Operation MI, the capture of Midway Atoll, was complex to the point of being fragile. The central idea was to use the announced invasion of Midway as bait to draw the American carriers out of Pearl Harbor and into an engagement where the combined Japanese fleet could destroy them. Yamamoto's forces for the operation were enormous. 4 fleet carriers of Kido Bu Tai under Admiral Nagumo, a separate invasion force, a heavy surface bombardment group, advanced submarine patrols, and Yamamoto's own main body of battleships and additional carriers positioned hundreds of miles to the rear. The theoretical Japanese advantage in carriers, 4 against the 3 Americans might be able to field if Yorktown was repaired in time, was supplemented by an overwhelming advantage in surface warships. The plan assumed that the American carriers would not know about the Midway operation until it was underway, that the submarine screen would detect and report American fleet movements in time to allow the carriers to be ambushed, and that Nagumo's strike groups would be free to hit Midway and then pivot to engage the American fleet. Every one of these assumptions failed. The American intelligence advantage at Midway was the decisive factor, and it's worth being specific about how it worked. The American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, working under Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been reading significant portions of Japanese naval cipher traffic. They had determined that a major operation was imminent against a target designated AF in the Japanese traffic. There was debate at higher levels about whether AF was Midway or the Aleutian Islands or even Hawaii. Rochefort's team ran a deception operation. They instructed Midway to transmit an uncoded radio message, reporting that its freshwater distilling plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese signals traffic included a reference to AF having a water shortage. AF was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, committed to the intelligence assessment, moved his carriers to an ambush position northeast of Midway, outside the area covered by the Japanese submarine screen, and waited. Yamamoto's elaborate plan to ambush the American fleet was about to be reversed. Nagumo's carriers launched their first strike against Midway at 04:30 on the 4th of June. The attack inflicted damage on the island's installations, but did not put the airfields out of action. American aircraft based on Midway, a mixed collection of Army Air Forces, Navy, and Marine Corps, planes of varying types, mounted a series of attacks against the Japanese carrier force during the morning of the 4th. These attacks were, by almost any tactical measure, disastrous. Torpedo bombers attacked at low altitude and were devastated by the combat air patrol of Zero fighters. Of the 41 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, 35 were shot down. Nearly all the crews were killed. They scored no torpedo hits. The attacks were tactically futile in isolation, but they achieved something that is only visible in retrospect. They pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to low altitude. They disrupted the deck operations on the Japanese carriers, and they fixed Nagumo's attention and his ship's guns on the sea surface just as American dive bombers arrived at high altitude from an unexpected direction. Chapter 7. The Turning Tide. The Battle of the Atlantic's critical year, 1943. There is a specific month that naval historians return to again and again when they want to identify the moment the Battle of the Atlantic turned. May of 1943. Schwarz Mai, Black May, is what the German U-boat arm called it afterward, and the name is accurate without being dramatic. In that single month, the Allies sank 41 German submarines. 41. Dönitz, who had been operating with roughly 120 boats at sea simultaneously, lost more than a third of his active frontline force in 30 days. The loss rate had become, in the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare, unsustainable. On the 24th of May, 1943, Dönitz withdrew the remaining U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. He didn't announce it as a retreat. He described it as a tactical repositioning. But everyone on both sides understood what it was. For the first time since the war began, the Allies could say, with genuine confidence, that they were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. The question worth spending time on is not simply that they won it, but how the winning happened. Because the story of May 1943 is really the story of the preceding 18 months of technological, organizational, and industrial development that made that month possible. The single most important technological development in the anti-submarine campaign was the centimetric radar. Before centimetric radar, specifically the 10 centimeter wavelength sets, produced using the cavity magnetron, a British invention from 1940 that was arguably one of the most consequential pieces of technology in the entire war. Shipborne and airborne radar operated on longer wavelengths that U-boats could detect using their METOX receivers. A surfaced U-boat could hear the radar emissions of an approaching aircraft or escort and dive before being found. It was a reasonably effective early warning system, and it kept Allied anti-submarine aircraft from achieving the kind of surprise contact rates that would have made the patrol aircraft truly lethal. The centimetric radar, installed progressively in Coastal Command aircraft and escort vessels through 1942 and into 1943, operated on a wavelength that the METOX receiver couldn't detect. U-boat commanders began reporting that aircraft were appearing without warning, that their radar detectors were giving them no protection. German signals engineers investigated and could not find the source of the problem. The U-boats were being found by a system they literally could not see coming, and the kill rate against surfaced submarines began to climb. The very long-range aircraft, specifically the modified consolidated B-24 Liberator bombers assigned to Coastal Command, and later to the United States Navy's patrol squadrons, closed the mid-Atlantic air gap that had been the U-boats' most reliable refuge throughout the war. The air gap was the stretch of ocean, roughly from roughly 30 degrees west to roughly 45 degrees west, that lay beyond the range of land-based patrol aircraft operating from either North America or Britain or Iceland. Convoys passing through the air gap had no air cover. U-boats could surface, communicate, regroup, and attack in relative safety. The gap was real, it was documented, and it killed ships. The British had been requesting very long-range aircraft for Coastal Command since 1941. The allocation of long-range aircraft was a genuinely contested resource question. Bomber Command under Arthur Harris wanted every available Liberator for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. And the argument between maritime patrol requirements and strategic bombing requirements was never entirely resolved on purely rational grounds. The allocation eventually shifted sufficiently that by the spring of 1943, Coastal Command had enough very long-range aircraft to begin providing continuous air cover across the Atlantic. When the air gap closed, U-boats that had been operating in that space were suddenly operating in covered water. The geometry of the battle changed. The development of the hunter-killer groups, designated support groups in Royal Navy terminology, represented an organizational evolution that complemented the technological improvements. The original Atlantic convoy escort groups were assigned to specific convoys, which meant they could not leave those convoys to chase and destroy a submarine contact. The submarine might be damaged, driven down, held at depth until the convoy passed, and then allowed to surface and resume operations because the escorts couldn't stay. Support groups were independent, unattached to specific convoys, and could be directed to the vicinity of a convoy under attack to hunt contacts to destruction. The 1st, 3rd, and 2nd support groups of the Royal Navy, and the American escort carrier groups operating in the same period, introduced genuine offensive anti-submarine capability to a campaign that had previously been dominated by defensive escorting. Captain Frederick John Walker, commanding the 2nd Support Group, became the most decorated anti-submarine commander of the war. His group sank more U-boats than any other Allied hunting unit, and his tactical innovation of the creeping attack, where one vessel held sonar contact at slow speed while directing another vessel that was running fast and deep to drop charges, represented genuine creative thinking about a tactical problem. Walker died of exhaustion in July 1944. He had never left the campaign long enough to rest. The role of the escort carrier, a converted merchant ship or purpose-built small carrier capable of embarking between 15 and 30 aircraft, deserves specific attention here because it was one of the more elegant solutions to the Atlantic problem. Fleet carriers were far too valuable to tie to convoy escort duty, but patrol aircraft were essential for finding and attacking surface submarines within a convoy battle. The escort carrier threaded this needle. Small enough to be built quickly and in large numbers, capable enough to operate anti-submarine aircraft on convoy duty. HMS Audacity, converted from a captured German merchant ship, was the first British escort carrier, commissioned in June 1941. She was sunk in December of the same year, but not before her operations had demonstrated the principle convincingly. American yards, specifically operating under the Accelerating Maritime Commission shipbuilding program, eventually produced over 100 escort carriers. The American designation was CVE, which sailors cheerfully rendered as combustible, vulnerable, and expendable, which was unkind but not entirely wrong. They were lightly built and lightly protected. They were also the mobile air power that made the U-boat's surface transit increasingly lethal. The signals intelligence dimension of the 1943 turning point is inseparable from the technological and tactical story. The cryptanalytic war between Bletchley Park's Hut 8 and the German B-Dienst, the Naval Signals Intelligence Organization, was not a one-sided contest. Through much of 1942, the Germans were reading the Allied convoy cipher number 3, which allowed B-Dienst to route U-boats toward convoys with genuine precision. The Allies, meanwhile, were periodically blacked out from the German naval Enigma traffic whenever the Germans introduced new settings or additional rotors. In February 1942, the German Navy introduced a fourth rotor to the submarine Enigma, designated Triton by the Germans and Shark by Bletchley Park, and the resulting blackout lasted until December 1942, 10 months during which convoy routing was conducted without the benefit of reading U-boat traffic. Those 10 months were among the bloodiest of the entire campaign. When Bletchley Park broke back into Shark, the routing situation immediately improved. When the Allies introduced cipher number 5 in June 1943, replacing the compromised cipher number 3, the B-Dienst advantage evaporated. For the remainder of the war, the intelligence balance strongly favored the Allies. I want to step back here and talk about the German side of this picture, because the standard telling of 1943 as a story of Allied success risks presenting it as inevitable, which it was not, and which is unfair to the reality Dönitz and his commanders were navigating. By early 1943, the U-boat construction program was producing approximately 20 to 30 new boats per month. Dönitz had more submarines operational in early 1943 than at any previous point in the war. He was losing boats, but he was also launching boats. And the question of whether the production rate could outpace the loss rate was genuinely open for several months. He also understood that the Allies were deploying new technology, and he set his engineers to work developing countermeasures. New radar detectors, snorkels that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged to recharge batteries, improved torpedoes, including the acoustic homing G7's torpedo, designated Zaunkönig or Wren, that homed on the propeller noise of escort vessels. These improvements were real, and some of them were effective. The snorkel, in particular, made the submerged U-boat a significantly more difficult target for aircraft, but none of them fully restored the offensive capability that the combination of centimetric radar, very long-range aircraft, support groups, escort carriers, and signals intelligence had stripped away. Dönitz had responded to the disaster of Black May by pushing his boat commanders to continue. But the loss rate never returned to a level that made the Atlantic campaign viable. The human accounting of the Atlantic campaign, the complete campaign from September 1939 through May 1945, is staggering. The Allies lost roughly 2,800 merchant ships and 175 warships in the Battle of the Atlantic. Approximately 36,000 merchant sailors died, from all nations, serving in ships that were not warships, carrying cargo that was not weapons. In waters they had to cross because somebody had to. The U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine suffered the highest proportional casualties of any military service on any side in the Second World War. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats, approximately 28,000 were killed and 5,000 were taken prisoner. More than 780 U-boats were eventually destroyed. The crews who sailed those submarines, many of them not ideologues, many of them young men from working families doing what they were ordered, had a service life expectancy that the submarine commander training program must have understood was measured in patrols rather than years. I find it necessary to hold these two things simultaneously. The campaign to stop the U-boats was essential and just, and the cost paid by the men inside those submarines was enormous and should not be written off as mere attrition statistics. The broader significance of winning the Battle of the Atlantic in 1943 was strategic in a way that goes beyond the tonnage numbers. The Atlantic supply line was the physical precondition for everything else the Allies intended to do in Europe. The buildup of American forces in Britain, designated Operation Bolero, required moving hundreds of thousands of soldiers and millions of tons of equipment across the ocean. The eventual invasion of Northwest Europe required all of that to have succeeded. The Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union, which kept the Red Army supplied through the worst years of the Eastern Front, required the Atlantic route to function. Grain shipments to Britain required Atlantic passage. Aviation fuel for the 8th Air Force required Atlantic passage. The defeat of the U-boat was not merely a naval success. It was the condition on which every other Allied offensive in Europe depended. When Captain Walker's group sank a U-boat in the Bay of Biscay, what he was actually doing, in a logistical sense, was clearing the way for everything from the bombing of the Ruhr to the landings in Normandy to the crossing of the Rhine. The connection is not metaphorical, it is causal. By the autumn of 1943, the Royal Canadian Navy was escorting roughly half of all Atlantic convoys, a contribution that is almost completely absent from popular accounts of the naval war. Canada began the war with a navy of roughly 3,500 men and 13 fighting vessels. By 1943, the Royal Canadian Navy had grown to over 400 ships and 60,000 men, and it was handling a workload that would have been unimaginable in 1939. The Canadian escort groups operated primarily in the North Atlantic, and they did so under conditions of severe equipment shortage. Their early vessels lacked the latest radar and anti-submarine gear. Their training had been rushed by the desperate need for hulls, and their operating area was among the most physically punishing in the world. When historians write about the Battle of the Atlantic, the names that tend to dominate are British admirals and American technological solutions and German submariners. The Canadians, who held the convoy routes together during the years before the technology caught up, deserve a more prominent accounting. Chapter 8: Fire and Blood in the Middle Sea. The Naval War in the Mediterranean, 1940 to 1943. The Mediterranean is roughly 3,200 kilometers from the Strait of Gibraltar to the Suez Canal, and in the Second World War it was simultaneously a British imperial lifeline, an Italian strategic ambition, a German operational imperative, and a graveyard. I've studied Mediterranean campaigns for years, and what strikes me still is how compressed the fighting was. How many different operational problems were layered into that single body of water at the same time. You had fleet engagements between battleships. You had submarine warfare. You had carrier aviation against shore targets. You had convoy interdiction and counter interdiction. You had amphibious landings. You had minefield campaigns. You had coastal artillery defending harbors, coastal torpedo boats ambushing supply convoys at night, flying boats conducting long-range reconnaissance over the open sea. Almost every form of naval warfare conducted in the entire Second World War was conducted in the Mediterranean, in a space roughly a quarter the size of the continental United States. Between the fall of France in June 1940 and the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Understanding the Mediterranean naval campaign is in some ways understanding the whole war in miniature. The strategic importance of Malta to the Allied Mediterranean campaign cannot be stated too strongly. Malta is a small island, 316 square kilometers, positioned almost precisely in the center of the Mediterranean, roughly 90 kilometers south of Sicily. In British hands, it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine base, from which the supply routes between Italy and North Africa could be severed. Axis convoys carrying fuel, tanks, ammunition, and men to Rommel's forces in Libya had to transit waters that could be covered by Malta-based aircraft and submarines. When Malta's striking forces were strong, Axis convoy losses to North Africa were heavy, and Rommel's operational capacity was constrained. When Malta was suppressed by air attack, Axis convoys got through and Rommel advanced. The direct relationship between Malta's operational effectiveness and the fortunes of the North African land campaign is one of the clearest examples in the war of how naval and air operations translated directly into army outcomes. Rommel himself, after the war, acknowledged that the critical failure of Axis strategy in North Africa was the failure to take Malta. He was right. And the people who kept Malta supplied and fighting at catastrophic cost deserve to be understood as having directly influenced the ground war hundreds of kilometers away. The siege of Malta, and it was a siege in the meaningful sense, reached its most critical point between the spring of 1941 and the summer of 1942. German and Italian air forces, operating from Sicily, subjected the island to sustained bombardment that reached a peak in April 1942, when Malta received more bomb tonnage than any comparable target in the entire war to that point. Supply convoys attempting to reach Malta from the west, from Gibraltar, or from the east, from Alexandria, had to run a gauntlet of air attack for the length of their transit within the Mediterranean, in waters where air cover from the island itself couldn't reach, and where Italian surface forces, submarine attack, and minefield barriers compounded the risk. Convoy after convoy was decimated. Operation Pedestal, in August 1942, sent 14 merchant ships through the western Mediterranean with an escort of 2 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers. One of the most powerful escort forces assembled for a convoy in the entire war. The convoy was attacked continuously for several days. 1 carrier, 1 cruiser, and 9 of the 14 merchant ships were sunk. The surviving ships, including the badly damaged American tanker Ohio, which arrived in Valletta Harbor partly submerged, supported on either side by destroyers, with her crew still at their posts, carried just enough fuel and supplies to keep Malta operational for another few months. The island held. The Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941 demonstrated both the best of Admiral Cunningham's aggressive instincts and the consequences of the Italian Navy operating without air cover in waters where signals intelligence was being used against them. British codebreakers had informed Cunningham that the Italian fleet, specifically a force including the heavy cruiser Polar and her sister ships, was operating southeast of Greece. Cunningham, maintaining the appearance of normality to avoid alerting Japanese naval attachés in Alexandria who might pass intelligence to the Axis, loaded his flagship with what looked like an admiral going ashore for an evening's socializing, and then slipped back aboard after dark to take the fleet to sea. Polar had been hit and stopped by aircraft from HMS Formidable. The Italian cruisers Zara and Fiume, sent back to assist Polar, found themselves under the guns of Cunningham's battleships in the dark without warning. Both cruisers were sunk at virtually point-blank range in a few minutes. 2 Italian destroyers were also sunk. More than 2,400 Italian sailors were killed. Cunningham stopped his fleet to attempt rescue operations and sent a signal to the Italian Naval Command, giving the position of survivors in the water. This was the action of a man who distinguished between the enemy's navy and the enemy's sailors, and it deserves to be noted. The Allied amphibious operations in the Mediterranean. Operation Torch in November 1942, Operation Husky in July 1943, represented the operational proving ground for the techniques that would eventually be applied at Normandy. Torch was the first major Anglo-American combined amphibious operation, landing Allied forces simultaneously at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers on the North African coast. The coordination required between American and British naval forces, between naval and ground components, between naval gunfire support and air cover and logistics. All of it was being done for the first time at scale, and all of it produced lessons, most of them painful. Timing was missed. Landing craft beached in the wrong places. Gunfire support was sometimes inadequately coordinated with troop movements. The Vichy French forces in North Africa offered varying degrees of resistance. At Casablanca, the French battleship Jean Bart, still incomplete but capable of firing her main battery from her moorings, engaged American warships before being silenced by the battleship Massachusetts. By the time of Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, the Allied amphibious system had absorbed the Torch lessons and performed considerably better, landing more than 478,000 men in the initial operation. These were rehearsals. The main event was still nearly a year away. The Italian naval position deteriorated steadily through 1942 and into 1943, driven by a combination of fuel shortages, losses that exceeded replacement capacity, and the progressive improvement of Allied anti-convoy capabilities. Italian warships ran on fuel oil and Italy's oil supply, dependent on Romanian imports and tanker routes that Malta-based submarines and aircraft were attacking with increasing effectiveness, was critically constrained. By mid-1942, Italian destroyers were sometimes unable to put to sea for lack of fuel. The operational tempo of the Regia Marina dropped sharply. Supply convoys to North Africa were suffering loss rates that reached 50% in some months of late 1942, when Field Marshal Rommel wrote to the German High Command pleading for supplies. When he cited fuel shortages as the reason his advances had stalled and his retreats had become inevitable, he was describing a direct consequence of the Allied maritime campaign in the Mediterranean. The naval war and the land war were the same war. The Allied submarine campaign in the Mediterranean deserves specific attention because it tends to be overshadowed by the surface and air engagements. British submarines, operating from Malta and Alexandria, were responsible for a significant portion of Axis convoy losses in the Mediterranean. The submarine base at Malta, designated the 10th Submarine Flotilla, operated under conditions of extraordinary difficulty, with the boats themselves being bombed in harbour and the crews living ashore in tunnelled shelters. Commander George Simpson, who commanded the 10th Flotilla, ran the most operationally aggressive submarine unit in the Royal Navy from a base that was literally under siege, with boats departing for patrol from a harbour that was being bombed regularly. The submarines HMS Upholder, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Malcolm Wanklyn, was the most successful British submarine of the war. She sank more than 90,000 tons of Axis shipping, including 2 troop ships and a destroyer, before being lost with all hands in April 1942. Wanklyn was awarded the Victoria Cross. The boats that operated from Malta during the siege period did so knowing that their patrol record came at a cost of extraordinary risk and that their base might not be there when they returned. Some were correct in that expectation. The Italian surrender in September 1943 created one of the strangest spectacles of the naval war. The terms of surrender included the provision that the Italian fleet, what remained of it, should sail to Allied-controlled ports. On the 9th of September 1943, Italian warships, including the battleships Roma, Italia, and Vittorio Veneto, departed Spezia and headed south. The Germans, who had anticipated the Italian surrender and had positioned their Luftwaffe appropriately, attacked the Italian fleet with Fritz-Deck's guided bombs. A relatively early example of a precision-guided weapon, Roma was hit twice and sank, with the loss of her crew of over 1,300 men. Italia was also hit but survived. The remaining Italian fleet, 5 battleships, 8 cruisers, and numerous smaller vessels, reached Malta and surrendered as agreed. Cunningham sent a signal to the Admiralty that has become one of the quotations of the naval war. Be pleased to inform their lordships that the Italian battle fleet now lies at anchor under the guns of the fortress of Malta. It was a remarkable sentence and a remarkable moment. 3 years earlier, Malta had been hanging on by its fingernails. Now it was the place where the Italian navy came to surrender. The campaign for the Dodecanese Islands in the autumn of 1943 represents one of the more painful British operational failures of the Mediterranean War, and I think it's worth describing precisely because it demonstrates that the strategic momentum of late 1943 was not an unbroken succession of Allied competence. Following the Italian armistice, Churchill pushed for a rapid seizure of the Italian-held Dodecanese Islands in the Aegean Sea, including Rhodes, Kos, and Leros, before the Germans could occupy them. The Americans, focused on the upcoming Normandy planning, refused to divert forces. The British proceeded with inadequate strength, landing on Kos and Leros with small garrisons. The Germans acted quickly, deploying airborne and seaborne forces to retake the islands. Allied naval forces attempting to supply and reinforce the garrisons operated in waters where German air power was dominant and where no carrier cover was available. Several destroyers and cruisers were sunk. Both Kos and Leros fell by late November. Over 3,000 British and 4,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. The Dodecanese failure came from the same kind of optimism that had produced disasters in the same theatre 2 years earlier. The assumption that the pace of strategic change would outrun German reaction speed. It didn't. What the Mediterranean campaign of 1940 through 1943 established at significant cost was the proof of several concepts that would define Allied naval strategy through the end of the war. It proved that combined arms maritime operations, carrier aviation, submarine warfare, surface escort, amphibious landings, naval gunfire support could be integrated and made to work. It proved that signals intelligence, properly used, was a genuine force multiplier. It proved that a heavily defended convoy route could be maintained through sustained effort against sophisticated opposition. It proved that air cover was not optional for surface forces operating within range of enemy land-based aircraft. It proved that the amphibious assault the most operationally complex form of military activity that human beings had devised, could be made to succeed against defended coastlines, provided you brought enough of everything. The Mediterranean was the laboratory. The beaches of Normandy were where the lessons were applied. Chapter 9: The Long Road North, Arctic Convoys and the War to Supply the Soviet Union, 1941 to 1945. If you want to understand what physical extremity looks like in naval warfare, you should read the accounts of men who sailed the Arctic convoys. Not the tactical accounts, those are interesting and important, but the physical accounts. What it felt like to stand watch on the bridge of an escort destroyer in the Barents Sea in January, when the temperature was below minus 20 degrees Celsius, when the spray from the waves was freezing on your oilskin as it landed, when the ship was rolling 35 to 40 degrees in sea states that made movement below decks a sustained act of deliberate determination, when the gun mechanisms were freezing and the depth charge rails were icing over, and the lookout needed to be relieved every 20 minutes before his hands stopped working. The Arctic convoys were fought in conditions that were indifferent to military outcome. The weather did not care who won. It was equally prepared to kill British sailors and German submariners, and it came very close to killing everyone. The strategic rationale for the Arctic convoys was straightforward and urgent. The Soviet Union, after the German invasion in June 1941, was in desperate need of war materiel: tanks, aircraft, vehicles, aluminum, explosives, food, and the raw materials to sustain its industrial base. Two potential supply routes existed: the Persian corridor through Iran, which was long and had limited capacity until the infrastructure was upgraded, and the Arctic route, which ran from ports in Iceland or Scotland northward around Norway's North Cape and into the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. The Arctic route was the shortest and had the best port capacity at the Soviet end, but it ran close to the Norwegian coast for much of its passage, within range of German air bases, submarine bases, and the surface fleet that Germany had positioned in the Norwegian fjords, specifically to threaten it. The convoys were designated PQ outbound and QP or RA returning, and the first sailed in August 1941, 2 months after Barbarossa. By the end of the war, 78 convoys had made the passage. More than 350 merchant ships had been sunk or turned back. Approximately 85 Allied warships were lost. The survivors delivered more than 4 million tons of cargo to the Soviet Union, including over 5,000 tanks, nearly 7,000 aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of tons of food and raw materials. The Kriegsmarine's Norwegian dispositions represented a concentrated form of threat that the Admiralty found acutely uncomfortable. Germany had stationed the battleship Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, and at the time the most powerful surface warship in the world. Along with the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the pocket battleship Lützow, renamed from Deutschland, partly to avoid the embarrassment of a ship named after a nation being sunk, and the heavy cruiser Hipper in the Norwegian fjords. These ships never had to actually sortie against the convoys to affect Allied strategy. Their mere presence, the threat that they might come out, forced the Admiralty to maintain a covering force of battleships and cruisers for every convoy passage, consuming warship resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. The strategic effect of the German surface force in Norway was achieved almost entirely by existing rather than by fighting. Churchill called Tirpitz the Beast and devoted enormous resources: bomber raids, midget submarine attacks, carrier strikes, to neutralizing her throughout her operational life. She never fired her main guns at an enemy ship. She was eventually destroyed in November 1944 by Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers dropping 12,000-pound tall boy bombs in Tromsø Fjord, Over 900 of her crew died. The dispersal of convoy PQ-17 in July 1942 is the most controversial episode in the Arctic convoy story and requires careful handling. PQ-17 was a convoy of 35 merchant ships that departed Iceland bound for Archangel in early July. Intelligence suggested that Tirpitz, Hipper, and other German heavy ships had left their anchorages and might be at sea. The first Sea Lord, Dudley Pound, made the decision on the 4th of July, 1942. Personally, late at night, against the advice of several of his staff officers, to order the convoy to scatter and the escorts to withdraw westward. The reasoning was that a concentrated convoy in the face of a potential surface attack was more vulnerable than individual ships making independently for Soviet ports. The actual German surface force turned back without engaging. The operation was called off partly from caution, partly from lack of air cover for the German ships. But the convoy, now dispersed across the Barents Sea with no escorts, was methodically hunted by German submarines and aircraft over the following days. 24 of the 35 merchant ships were sunk. Over 150 merchant sailors died. 133,000 tons of cargo, including 210 aircraft, 430 tanks, and approximately 3,000 vehicles, went to the bottom. The American crews, who made up a significant portion of the merchant fleet, were furious. Pound's decision has been debated ever since. Most historians who have examined it in detail conclude that it was a serious error, made under pressure and with incomplete intelligence. The experiences of the merchant sailors who served the Arctic run were distinct from those of any other convoy route, partly because of the physical conditions and partly because of a peculiarity of the political situation. Soviet port authorities were often bureaucratically obstructive, sometimes hostile, and occasionally actively unhelpful to Allied sailors who arrived at Murmansk after surviving weeks of passage under attack. The sailors were not permitted to move freely ashore. Shore leave was restricted or denied. The paperwork for offloading cargo was sometimes deliberately delayed. This was partly Soviet suspicion of foreign military personnel, partly bureaucratic rigidity, and possibly partly a reflection of the complicated ideological position of accepting aid from capitalist nations. Whatever the reason, the sailors who had survived torpedo attacks, aircraft bombing, and Arctic weather to deliver their cargoes found, in some accounts, that their reception at the destination was distinctly less warm than the physical environment. The Soviet Union never formally acknowledged the strategic importance of Allied Lend-Lease supplies during the war and did not do so for decades afterward. The sailors who made the run found this assessment, when they eventually encountered it, difficult to accept. The midget submarine attacks on Tirpitz in September 1943 represent one of the more audacious operations of the war and deserve specific description. 6 X-class midget submarines, vessels roughly 15 meters long, with a crew of 4 capable of submerging and designed to penetrate defended anchorages, were towed to within striking distance of the Norwegian fjords by full-size submarines and then cast off to make their own way to the target. 2 of the 6 reached Tirpitz in Fjord. The crews placed 2-ton side charges under the ship's hull and attempted to withdraw. Some crew members were captured before they could escape. The charges detonated under Tirpitz and caused serious damage to her machinery, putting her out of action for approximately 6 months. The crews who placed the charges and were captured were awarded the Victoria Cross in captivity, which the German authorities permitted to be announced. 2 of the 4 VC recipients survived the war. The Tirpitz was never again fully operational. The midget submarine attack didn't sink her, but it neutralized the principal surface threat to the Arctic convoys for half a year and contributed to the eventual decision to use bomber aircraft to finish the work the midget submarines had started. The Arctic campaign also encompassed what I consider one of the cleanest ship versus ship tactical engagements of the European naval war. The Battle of the North Cape on the 26th of December, 1943. The German battlecruiser Scharnhorst, a ship that had been a thorn in the Royal Navy's side since the Norway campaign in 1940, sortied from Norway to attack convoy JW55B. British signals intelligence had broken the relevant German signals traffic. Admiral Bruce Fraser, commanding the covering force aboard the battleship Duke of York, positioned his ships to intercept. Scharnhorst encountered the escort cruisers first. HMS Belfast, HMS Norfolk, HMS Sheffield was hit, broke off, was found again, broke off again. Finally, Duke of York came into gun range in Arctic darkness, lit only by starshell illumination. The battleship hit Scharnhorst with her 14-inch guns, reducing her speed. Destroyers moved in with torpedoes. Additional torpedo hits stopped her. She sank at approximately 1945 hours. Of her crew of approximately 1,968 men, 36 were rescued by British destroyers operating in frigid water. It was the last time a German capital ship sortied against an Allied convoy. The statistical record of Allied materiel delivered to the Soviet Union via the Arctic route, and also via the Persian corridor and the Pacific route, requires a brief digression because the numbers matter and because the question of their strategic significance has been genuinely contested. Total American Lend-Lease deliveries to the Soviet Union amounted to approximately $11 billion of equipment and supplies at wartime prices, a figure that translates into approximately 17.5 million tons of cargo. This included 407,000 trucks, over 13,000 armored vehicles, nearly 19,000 aircraft, and approximately 1,500,000 tons of food. Soviet historians and some Western historians have argued that these supplies, while significant, were supplementary rather than decisive, that the Soviet Union would have found ways to sustain its war effort regardless. American and British historians have generally argued that the timing was critical. The deliveries in 1942 and early 1943 came at precisely the period when the Soviet industrial relocation program, moving factories east of the Urals, was not yet back at full production, and that without the bridging supply of food, vehicles, and aviation fuel during that period, the Soviet military position would have been significantly more precarious. The historiographical debate continues. The final Arctic convoy sailed in May 1945, after the German surrender. Over the entire course of the campaign, 16 Allied warships were lost in the Arctic, along with 87 merchant ships from convoys that were attacked. The human cost included nearly 3,000 Allied sailors killed, German losses defending Norway against the convoys. U-boats sunk, aircraft destroyed, the eventual loss of Scharnhorst and the disabling of Tirpitz were significant, and the entire Norwegian defensive operation consumed German naval and air resources that were never available for other theatres. There is an argument, not unreasonable, that the Arctic convoy threat forced Germany to maintain forces in Norway that could have been employed more consequentially elsewhere. Norway as a strategic dead end for the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine was, from an Allied perspective, an acceptable outcome. The convoys achieved their supply objective. They also achieved the secondary objective of fixing German forces in a theatre that produced no German strategic return. At a cost that was substantial and should not be minimized, they succeeded on both counts. Chapter 10. Island by Island, the Pacific Campaign and the Logic of Amphibious Warfare, 1942 to 1944. The Pacific War. Once the initial shock of Japanese expansion had been absorbed and the American industrial mobilization had begun to take effect, became fundamentally a logistical problem expressed in military terms. But the question was not whether the United States could eventually project sufficient force to defeat Japan. Given the production numbers, American shipyards were completing Essex-class fleet carriers at a rate that Japanese strategists couldn't match. And by 1944, the United States Navy had more fleet and light carriers operational than Japan had possessed at any point in the war. The question of whether was always going to be answered yes. The real questions were how, and at what cost, and by what route. And those questions of route and method and cost produced one of the more interesting strategic debates of the war. The choice between two competing approaches to reaching Japan, which the military historians designate as the Central Pacific Thrust and the Southwest Pacific Approach. Understanding that debate and understanding how it was resolved and understanding what amphibious warfare at Pacific scale actually looked like in practice requires sitting with the geography and the engineering simultaneously. The American naval and amphibious strategy in the Pacific was built on a chain of logic that ran like this. Japan's inner defensive perimeter was protected by a network of island bases that provided air cover, submarine support, and logistical staging for the defense of the home islands. To reach Japan, those bases had to be reduced, either by direct assault or by isolation and starvation. Reducing them by direct assault required landing troops on heavily defended beaches under fire, which required naval gunfire support to suppress beach defenses, carrier air cover to prevent enemy aircraft from attacking the landing force, transport ships to move the troops, supply ships to sustain them once ashore, and sufficient combat power to overcome defenders who were operating from fortified positions and who, by the doctrine and culture of the Imperial Japanese Army, would not surrender. This last point, the no-surrender doctrine, shaped the entire character of the Pacific Ground War in ways that had profound naval implications, because an island garrison that chose to fight to the last man required a level of sustained naval gunfire support and naval logistical supply that would have seemed extraordinary for a conventional campaign. Guadalcanal, the campaign that lasted from August 1942 to February 1943, was the first major American offensive operation of the Pacific War, and the naval dimension of that campaign was both larger and more costly than popular accounts typically reflect. The initial Marine landings on the 7th of August 1942 secured the airstrip that the Japanese were building on the island. But the Japanese Navy responded aggressively, and the subsequent battles around the island consumed ships and men at a rate that genuinely alarmed American planners. The Battle of Savo Island on the 9th of August, the night action in which Japanese cruisers under Admiral Guniji Gahawa surprised and destroyed 4 Allied heavy cruisers in roughly 30 minutes, was the worst peacetime defeat of the United States Navy in open water combat since roughly the War of 1812. The Japanese had used the darkness, superior night fighting training, and exceptional torpedo performance to devastate a force that should, by raw numbers, have been adequate to defend the anchorage. Over 1,023 American and Australian sailors died in that single night engagement. The wounded transport ships, without their escort, withdrew from the area, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal without their supply ships. What followed on Guadalcanal was a 6-month naval campaign of attrition fought in the waters around the island, a stretch of ocean that the sailors themselves named Iron Bottom Sound, a name that has an accuracy to it that no official designation could improve on. Between August 1942 and February 1943, there were 6 major naval surface engagements in those waters. Both sides lost ships in approximately equal measure during the autumn. The Battle of Cape Esperance, the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November, the Battle of Tassafaronga, and the Japanese were running a nightly destroyer supply run down the channel between the islands, which American sailors named the Tokyo Express, that kept the island garrison supplied, despite American air dominance during daylight hours. The Japanese destroyers would race down at night, drop supplies in floating drums, and race back before dawn, and the American surface forces tasked with stopping them kept encountering Japanese long-lance torpedoes in the dark and paying for the encounters with ships. The long-lance, properly the Type 93 torpedo, was a pure oxygen-driven weapon with a range and warhead size that exceeded any comparable Allied weapon, and it remained a tactical advantage in night surface engagements throughout the campaign. The development of American amphibious doctrine. The specific techniques for landing troops under fire on defended beaches was an ongoing and empirical process throughout the Pacific campaign, and the cost of learning was paid in lives on beach after beach. The landing craft vehicle personnel, the LCVP, designed by Andrew Higgins and built in enormous numbers, could carry 36 men or its payload equivalent from ship to shore under fire. The landing vehicle tracked. The LVT, an amphibious tractor that could cross a reef and deliver troops directly onto a beach, was essential for operations at atolls like Tarawa, where the water depth over the reef prevented conventional landing craft from reaching shore. At Tarawa in November 1943, the first use of LVTs in combat assault, the assault went ahead with insufficient LVTs, and with a tidal miscalculation that left subsequent waves of conventional landing craft hung up on the reef under fire. More than 1,000 United States Marines were killed in roughly 76 hours of fighting on an island roughly 3 kilometers long. When photographs of the American dead on Tarawa's beaches were released in the United States, a deliberate decision by American authorities to prepare the public for the real cost of Pacific operations. There was genuine shock at the visual evidence of what taking a defended island actually looked like. The role of the fast carrier task forces. The force designated Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher in the Central Pacific Campaign of 1943 and 1944 was the operational expression of everything the pre-war carrier aviators had argued for. The Essex-class carriers, entering service from late 1942, were far more capable than any previous American carrier. They could embark 90 to 100 aircraft, had improved armor and damage control, and could sustain operations in a way that the pre-war Yorktown-class ships could not. By early 1944, Task Force 58 consisted of multiple carrier groups operating together 12 to 15 fleet and light carriers in 4 task groups, capable of putting more than 600 aircraft into the air simultaneously. This force could neutralize land-based air power at a target island, suppress its beach defenses, maintain air cover over the landing force, and strike deep into the Japanese rear to prevent reinforcement, all simultaneously. The Japanese defensive strategy that relied on island-based air power as a first line of defense was being stripped away by a mobile force that could hit one target, disappear, and hit another before the defense could react. The Mariana Islands campaign in the summer of 1944. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam was strategically significant beyond the islands themselves, because the Marianas brought Japan's home islands within range of the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress very long-range bomber. Admiral Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, and the Marine and Army assault forces took Saipan between mid-June and mid-July at the cost of nearly 3,000 American killed and roughly 13,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison of roughly 31,000 men was almost entirely killed. The Japanese senior commanders both died during the battle, and significant numbers of Japanese civilians who had been told by Japanese propaganda that American soldiers would torture and kill them, died during mass suicides at the island's northern cliffs. It was a preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would mean, and it registered in American military planning as such. The Marianas Campaign is also where the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, formerly the Battle of the Philippine Sea, occurred, which we'll address as a related but distinct episode. The Philippine Sea engagement of the 19th and 20th of June 1944 was the largest carrier battle of the war, and ended with Japanese carrier aviation effectively destroyed as an offensive force. Admiral Ozawa's first mobile fleet, with 9 carriers, sorted to contest the American landing at Saipan. American submarines USS Albacore and USS Kavala found Ozawa's force and sank the fleet carriers Taiho, Ozawa's flagship and Japan's newest and largest carrier, and Shokaku. American combat air patrols, guided by radar, and flying the new Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter, which was specifically designed to outperform the Zero, and in every significant parameter did exactly that, destroyed the Japanese strike aircraft in successive waves at enormous ratios. American pilots reported the battle as target-rich in a way that produced the informal designation that survives: the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost approximately 395 aircraft and their crews, plus 3 carriers, in 2 days. The experienced pilots who had not been killed at Midway and Coral Sea were now, overwhelmingly, gone. Japan still had carriers. It no longer had the trained aircrew to fill them with effectiveness. The logic of the island-hopping campaign, the decision to bypass heavily garrisoned Japanese islands rather than assault every one of them, came from Admiral Nimitz and from General Douglas MacArthur's competing approaches, and the debate between them was never fully settled by argument, only by events. Nimitz's Central Pacific approach preferred bypassing large garrisons, leaving them to wither without supply, and moving quickly along the chain of islands toward the Marianas, Formosa, or Luzon. MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific approach through New Guinea toward the Philippines, insisted on the liberation of the Philippines as a moral and strategic imperative. Roosevelt's decision in favor of the Philippines approach came partly from the genuine strategic argument, and partly from MacArthur's formidable political weight. The 2 drives, Central Pacific and Southwest Pacific, converged on the Philippines in October 1944, and at Leyte Gulf, Japan attempted to stop them with everything it had left. The infrastructure that sustained the Pacific campaign was as remarkable as the campaign itself, and it tends to receive less attention because it is less dramatic than battle narratives. Mobile Service Squadron 10, one of several mobile support squadrons, could repair, rearm, and refuel an entire carrier task group at an advanced anchorage, performing the logistical function that normally required a fixed dockyard. The American capacity to build forward bases on captured islands within weeks of their capture, constructing airstrips, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, hospital facilities, and harbour infrastructure on islands that had been jungle and coral a month earlier, represented an engineering achievement that had no precedent in military history. The Seabees, the United States Navy's construction battalions, whose motto was Construmus Bitumus, we build, we fight, built more than 400 advanced bases across the Pacific. Without that infrastructure, the advance could not have been sustained at the pace it maintained. The combat operations were the visible face of the Pacific War. The logistics were the skeleton that held the visible face up. Chapter 11. The Greatest Sea Battle Ever Fought. Leyte Gulf, October 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from the 23rd to the 26th of October 1944, was by almost every measurable standard the largest naval battle in history. The numbers are genuinely staggering. The United States and Australian forces committed 218 warships, and Japan committed 64. The battle was fought across an area of roughly 100,000 square kilometers of the Western Pacific, a region larger than the entire Korean peninsula. Over the 4 days of the engagement, Japan lost 3 battleships, 4 fleet carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The United States lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. For Japan, Leyte Gulf was the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a functioning battle force. For the Allies, it was the naval dimension of the liberation of the Philippines. For the historian, it is a battle of such complexity, with 4 distinct sub-engagements, multiple command failures on both sides, acts of extraordinary courage at several points, and at least one moment where the outcome of the entire operation hung on a single decision, that the full story resists easy compression. But that is precisely the kind of story worth telling carefully. The Japanese plan for Leyte Gulf, Operation Sho Ichigo, meaning Victory Plan 1, was audacious in the way that plans tend to become audacious when the party conceiving them has no good conventional options. The essence of the plan was to use Japan's remaining carrier force, now largely devoid of trained aircrew, as a decoy to draw the American fast carrier groups, Halsey's Third Fleet, away from the landing area at Leyte Gulf. While the carriers decoyed Halsey northward, 2 powerful surface forces would converge on the Leyte landing area from the west through the Sibuyan Sea and Surigao Strait, penetrate to the beaches, and destroy the amphibious shipping carrying MacArthur's invasion force, the transports, the landing craft, the supply ships. Without them, the invasion could not succeed, regardless of who held the beaches. It was a plan that sacrificed the carrier force entirely, that required precise coordination between forces separated by hundreds of kilometers, and that would work only if Halsey took the bait. Halsey took the bait. The surface action in Surigao Strait in the early hours of the 25th of October 1944 was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history, and it went almost exactly as the textbooks said it should. The Japanese Southern Force, 2 old battleships, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, moved up Surigao Strait in the darkness toward the Leyte Gulf. Waiting for them at the northern end of the strait were 6 American battleships under Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, arranged in a line perpendicular to the Japanese advance. The classic crossing of the T, allowing the American ships to fire full broadsides while the Japanese could bring only their forward guns to bear. 5 of the 6 American battleships had been damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor. They had been raised, repaired, modernized, and now they were waiting in the dark for a chance at the ships that had started this war. Nishimura's flagship, the battleship Yamashiro, was sunk. The battleship Fuso was also sunk. Nearly all of Nishimura's force was destroyed. The American battleships at Surigao Strait had their revenge for Pearl Harbor, and the circumstances were as complete as revenge ever is in warfare. The Central Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the most powerful of the 3 Japanese surface forces, including the superb battleship Yamato and her sister Musashi, as well as 3 other battleships, 10 cruisers, and 15 destroyers, was the main strike element of the Japanese plan. Moving through the Sibuyan Sea during the 24th of October, the Central Force was attacked by American carrier aircraft throughout the day. The Musashi, 68,000 tons displacement, 9 18-inch guns, the largest warship ever built to that point, was struck by approximately 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes before sinking. The sheer number of hits required to sink her was a testimony to her constructors. Kurita, under sustained air attack, reversed course temporarily, which led American commanders, including Halsey, to conclude that the central force had been sufficiently damaged to pose a diminished threat. This assessment was wrong. Kurita reversed course again after dark and continued toward the San Bernardino Strait. The action off Samar on the morning of the 25th of October was the engagement that could have ended the entire Philippines operation, and it very nearly did. Kurita's central force: 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, emerged from the San Bernardino Strait before dawn and came down on a force of American escort carriers and destroyers designated Taffy 3 under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Taffy 3 was not a battle force. It consisted of 6 small escort carriers, the CVEs, the combustible, vulnerable, expendable ones, and 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts, tasked with supporting the amphibious operations with close air support. They were not expecting to fight a surface engagement against battleships. When Kurita's force appeared on the horizon and his 18-inch shells began raising enormous colored waterspouts around the American ships, Sprague did something that has no obvious explanation in terms of rational self-preservation. He attacked. His destroyers, Hoyle, Hierman, Johnston, charged the Japanese battle line, firing torpedoes, making smoke, trying to keep the escort carriers alive long enough for aircraft to get airborne. Johnston was hit repeatedly and eventually sunk, but her attacks disrupted Kurita's formation. The escort carrier pilots flew repeated strikes with whatever ordnance they had. When they ran out of bombs and torpedoes, some reportedly made dry runs to distract Japanese gunners. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was sunk by gunfire, the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war. Kurita's withdrawal, when it came, was one of the most analysed decisions of the Pacific War, with the amphibious shipping at Leyte Gulf within range, with the Taffy 3 force nearly destroyed, with no effective American battle force between his ships and the beaches. Kurita reversed course and withdrew. His stated reasons included fuel concerns, aircraft losses, communications confusion about the status of the decoy operation, and uncertainty about what forces might lie ahead. Historians have debated the decision ever since. Some argue he was disoriented by the ferocious resistance of Taffy 3 and couldn't believe the force that had fought him so hard was all there was. Some point to his fuel state and the genuine risk of his ships running dry in enemy waters. Some suggest the sustained air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea had damaged his judgment. Whatever the reason, the withdrawal meant that the Leyte landing force survived. The Philippines operation continued. Japan had played its last significant naval card, and the card had not won the hand. Mid-sentence. Resuming from the Leyte Gulf Northern Engagement. Chapter 11. The Greatest Sea Battle Ever Fought. Leyte Gulf, October 1944, the Northern Engagement. The chase after Ozawa's carrier decoys produced the most heated controversy of Halsey's entire career, and a signal exchange that became famous in naval circles immediately after the war. Admiral William Halsey, commanding 3rd Fleet, took the bait completely, leading his entire battleship force and fast carrier groups northward in pursuit of Ozawa's empty carriers, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. When Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commanding the 7th Fleet, realized what was happening and that Kurita's central force was already through the strait and engaging Taffy 3, he sent increasingly urgent signals to Halsey. Nimitz himself, at Pearl Harbor, sent a message asking the famous question, "Where is Task Force 30 FAR?" The actual message, as transmitted, included phrases at beginning and end to confuse Japanese code breakers. Standard practice, but the padding at the end, "The world wonders," was not stripped out before delivery. Halsey read, "Where is Task Force 30 FAR?" The world wonders as a personal humiliation from Nimitz, and later said he was so angry he had to leave the bridge to recover. He turned his force around, but too late to intercept Kurita, who was already withdrawing. Ozawa's carriers, Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor strike force, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, were all sunk in the engagement off Cape Engano on the 25th of October. Zuikaku went down flying an enormous battle ensign, her crew assembled on deck saluting as she sank. She had been at Pearl Harbor. She had been at Coral Sea. She had launched aircraft at Midway and survived when her sisters didn't. There was something genuinely final about her loss at Leyte Gulf. Not the last Japanese carrier sunk in the war, but in some ways the most symbolic, the physical connection to the beginning of the Pacific War, going down at its effective conclusion. Japan launched the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, with 6 carriers. By October of 1944, those 6 carriers were either on the ocean floor or functionally incapable of sustained operations. The symmetry of that fact does not require editorial comment. The kamikazes at Leyte Gulf were not yet the organized, systematic campaign they would become by Okinawa, but they made their first significant appearance during this battle. On the 25th of October, organized special attack units of the Japanese Navy, the Tokotai, which the Americans named kamikazes after the divine winds that had reportedly dispersed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, struck the escort carrier USS Saint Lo with a deliberate aircraft crash loaded with bombs and fuel. Saint Lo sank. She was the first ship sunk by a deliberate kamikaze attack in the war. The tactic had a specific tactical logic, however grim. A conventional aircraft attack required a pilot to survive the anti-aircraft fire, release weapons accurately, and escape. All steps that reduced the probability of a hit on any given sortie. A kamikaze attack traded pilot survival for a certainty of contact if the aircraft reached its target. Given that Japan was running out of trained pilots and had aircraft that were increasingly being outmatched by American fighters, the exchange ratio was one that Japanese naval air commanders believed was militarily rational. It was also the clearest possible statement about what the war had become for Japan by late 1944. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf can be stated precisely. Japan lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers in 4 days. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again mount a significant fleet operation. Its remaining heavy ships would be held back, hoarding fuel, waiting for the invasion of the home islands, hoping to make one final stand. The carrier force was gone as an operational instrument. The surface fleet was crippled. The submarine force, which had achieved significant early results in the Pacific, had by this point suffered such catastrophic losses to American anti-submarine warfare that it was also a diminished force. What Japan had left in terms of naval capability was the kamikaze campaign and the coastal defense potential of its remaining surface ships. Neither was capable of reversing the strategic situation. Leyte Gulf was not, strictly speaking, the last battle of the Pacific Naval War. That distinction belongs to the operations around Okinawa and the final air and surface actions of 1945. But it was the last battle where Japan had the capacity to change the outcome. After Leyte Gulf, the Pacific War had only one possible ending. Chapter 12, Divine Wind, the Kamikaze Campaign and the war's final naval phase, 1944 to 1945. I want to be careful about how I describe the kamikaze phenomenon, because it is one of those subjects where the gap between what actually happened and the way it gets discussed in Western military history is particularly wide. The standard Western treatment tends to oscillate between 2 poles, either a kind of horrified incomprehension at the deliberate self-destruction, or a romanticization of it as a form of martial transcendence. Both of these responses are, I think, inadequate to the reality. The young men who flew those missions were not primarily fanatics. And they were not primarily warriors seeking a beautiful death. Many of them were university students, drafted into military service, trained quickly because there was no time for full training, told that this was what their country required, and sent to die in ways that their own letters and diaries, those that survived, describe with a complexity and a grief that the simple narratives on either side don't accommodate. Reading the last letters of kamikaze pilots, collected by later Japanese historians, is one of the more disquieting archival experiences available in Second World War research. What you find in many cases is not fanaticism. What you find is young men trying to say goodbye to their mothers. The formal organization of the Tokatai, the Special Attack Units, began in October 1944 under Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines. Onishi had concluded that Japan's conventional naval air arm no longer had the trained pilots or the superior aircraft to make a significant impact against American carrier forces through orthodox attack methods. The F-6F Hellcat was shooting down Japanese aircraft at kill ratios that made conventional attacks unsustainable. If a pilot was likely to be shot down before reaching his target anyway, the reasoning went, why not guarantee contact by making the aircraft itself the weapon? The first organized Tokatai attacks in the Philippines in October 1944 demonstrated that the tactic worked against ships with a distressing efficiency. A diving aircraft maneuvering in its final approach was harder to shoot down than a level or torpedo-run attacker. If it got through, it hit, and it hit with both aircraft and fuel load combined. The USS St. Louis loss confirmed the tactic's lethality. The organization of special attack units accelerated. The American anti-kamikaze defense evolved through experience, and the evolution was driven by the carrier and destroyer commanders who were on the receiving end rather than by centralized doctrine handed down from above. The principal defense was the combat air patrol, fighter aircraft orbiting above the fleet, directed by ship-based radar onto incoming attackers before they could reach their targets. The radar picket destroyer, a destroyer or destroyer escort, positioned up to 100 kilometers in front of the main fleet, providing early radar detection and acting as a forward control point for the combat air patrol, became both the first warning system and the first target for kamikaze attack. The picket destroyers suffered disproportionately. The radar picket stations around Okinawa became the most dangerous assignments in the American Pacific Fleet by the spring of 1945. Destroyers were hit repeatedly. Some ships were struck multiple times and kept fighting. The USS Laffey was struck by 4 kamikazes and hit by 4 bombs in under 80 minutes on the 16th of April, 1945, while on radar picket duty off Okinawa and stayed afloat. Her survival was attributed partly to damage control that was, by any assessment, extraordinary, and partly to the fact that she had simply taken everything the attackers had, and there was nothing left to hit her with. The Battle of Okinawa, Operation Iceberg, from the 1st of April to the 22nd of June, 1945, was the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War, and, in terms of naval casualties, the costliest American naval campaign of the entire conflict. The United States Navy committed roughly 1,400 ships to the operation, landing approximately 548,000 ground force personnel on the island. The Japanese responded with the most concentrated kamikaze campaign of the war. 10 massed attacks designated kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, each involving between 50 and 350 aircraft, along with continuous smaller attacks throughout the campaign. Over the 82 days of the battle, the United States Navy suffered approximately 9,800 naval casualties, more than 4,000 dead, making Okinawa the bloodiest naval battle in American history. 36 ships were sunk, predominantly by kamikaze attack. 368 were damaged. The toll was real, it was paid in blood, and it registered directly in the calculations that American planners were making about the cost of invading the Japanese home islands. The final sortie of the Yamato on the 6th and 7th of April, 1945, was a mission that her own commanders knew could only end one way, and the knowledge was deliberate. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, displacing approximately 72,000 tons fully loaded, mounting 9 18-inch guns, was sent south from Japan toward Okinawa with a one-way fuel load. The plan, designated Operation Ten Ichigo, was for Yamato to beach herself near Okinawa and serve as a fixed artillery battery, fighting until she was destroyed. She carried enough fuel to reach Okinawa, but not to return. She was intercepted by American carrier aircraft approximately 320 kilometers northeast of Okinawa. 386 aircraft struck her in successive waves. She was hit by approximately 8 bombs and 10 or 11 torpedoes. The exact number remains uncertain because the aircraft attack logs don't fully reconcile, and sank in roughly 2 hours, taking approximately 2,740 men with her. She was not a useful weapon in her final battle. She was a statement, a very expensive, very lethal statement about what the Japanese military culture was prepared to ask of its servicemen in 1945. The gap between what Yamato was built to do and what she actually accomplished in her operational life is one of the more striking studies in the distance between institutional expectation and strategic reality. The American submarine campaign in the Pacific deserves its own extended reckoning because it was one of the most operationally effective campaigns of the entire war and receives less sustained attention than the carrier battles. American submarines, operating primarily from Pearl Harbor and later from Midway, Brisbane, and Fremantle, systematically dismantled the Japanese merchant fleet, the oil tanker fleet, and the military supply routes that sustained Japan's island garrisons and Japan's home industrial base. By the final year of the war, American submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japan could replace them, and had reduced Japanese oil imports to a trickle. The Japanese home industrial base, which required imported iron ore, coal, rubber, and oil from the southern resource area, was being starved. The submarines didn't win the war alone. No single service or weapon system did. But the strangulation of Japan's seaborne supply lines was as consequential as any campaign in the Pacific theater. At Leyte Gulf, Kurita withdrew partly because his ships were running low on fuel. Partly because the submarine campaign had been cutting Japanese tanker routes for 2.5 years. The connections were causal. The American submarine campaign was not without its own serious problems in the early war period. American torpedoes, specifically the Mark 14 steam torpedo and the Mark 6 exploder, were defective. The magnetic exploder, designed to detonate beneath a ship's hull and break her keel, malfunctioned with enough consistency to turn what should have been certain kills into duds that bounced off hulls and failed to fire. The contact exploder had a design flaw. When a torpedo struck at a perpendicular angle, the ideal shot, the firing pin was being driven too hard and too fast, and the mechanism was crushing rather than detonating. Submarine commanders reported the problem from the first months of the war. The Bureau of Ordnance resisted the conclusion for over a year, suggesting instead that the commanders were making targeting errors. It was not until August of 1943 that the defects were formally acknowledged and corrective modifications ordered. The human cost of that institutional resistance, the patrols that came home without having made kills because their weapons didn't function, is not precisely calculable. What is calculable is that once the torpedo problems were corrected, American submarine kill rates increased sharply and stayed high. The final months of the Pacific Naval War, from the end of the Okinawa campaign in June 1945 through the Japanese surrender in September, were characterized by a peculiar combination of overwhelming American dominance and the grinding preparations for what everyone involved believed would be the most costly invasion in history. American carrier aircraft were ranging freely over the Japanese home islands, striking airfields, port facilities, naval installations, and the remnants of Japanese shipping. British carrier forces. The British Pacific Fleet, the largest fleet the Royal Navy had ever assembled for a single operation, built around 4 fleet carriers with armoured flight decks, had joined the American operations and were demonstrating, in the process, that the armoured deck carriers could absorb kamikaze hits that would have gutted an American carrier with a wooden flight deck. When a kamikaze struck HMS Formidable, the damage control report to the bridge was famously laconic. Fire extinguished. 6 killed, 7 wounded. Flight deck operational. When a kamikaze struck USS Bunker Hill under similar circumstances, the casualty count was 393, and she was out of action for the rest of the war. The armoured deck was not a perfect defence, but the difference was real. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, was never executed. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945, and Nagasaki on the 9th of August, followed by the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, beginning on the 9th of August, produced the Japanese decision to surrender that was announced on the 15th of August. The formal surrender ceremony was conducted on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September, 1945, with General Douglas MacArthur presiding and Admiral Chester Nimitz signing for the United States. The naval dimension of the surrender ceremony was deliberate. The war in the Pacific had been fundamentally a naval war, and it ended on the deck of a warship in a harbour, surrounded by the fleet that had won it. The question of whether the atomic bombs, or the Soviet entry, or the cumulative economic strangulation produced by the submarine campaign was the decisive factor in Japan's surrender is a historiographical debate that has generated more heat than light over the following decades. The most honest answer is that all 3 factors were operating simultaneously, and their individual weights are genuinely difficult to separate. Chapter 13, The Forgotten Fleet, Britain's War in the Indian Ocean and the Far East, 1942 to 1945. There is a theatre of the naval war that practically every documentary, every popular history, and every commemorative programme manages to address in either a footnote or a single paragraph. And I've always thought that was an injustice to the sailors who served in it. The Indian Ocean and the Far Eastern Naval Campaign, the operations of the British Eastern Fleet, and later the British Pacific Fleet, stretching from East Africa across to Ceylon and eventually to the waters off Japan, involved hundreds of thousands of sailors from Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and South Africa. It lasted from the fall of Singapore in February 1942 through the Japanese surrender in September 1945. At its lowest point, it consisted of a handful of old ships trying to stay out of range of a Japanese carrier force that could have sunk them with relative ease. At its highest point, it was a fleet that fought alongside the American Navy in the final operations against Japan itself. The story between those 2 points is one of the more remarkable rebuilding narratives in British naval history. The nadir of British naval power in the Indian Ocean came in April 1942, when Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led the same carrier striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor into the Indian Ocean for a series of raids. The British Eastern Fleet under Admiral James Somerville had been warned by signals intelligence that the Japanese were coming and wisely declined to offer battle. His force included old, slow carriers and battleships that would have been destroyed in a fleet engagement against Nagumo's 6 fleet carriers. The Japanese sank the carrier HMS Hermes and the cruisers HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, along with several smaller vessels. Over 1,000 British sailors died. Somerville's fleet retreated to bases in East Africa, out of range. For a period of several months, the Japanese Navy could, had it chosen to, operated with relative freedom in the Indian Ocean and potentially threatened the sea routes through which oil from the Middle East and supplies from India flowed to Britain and to the Soviet Union via the Persian corridor. The Japanese did not choose to exploit this opportunity, partly because of strategic priorities elsewhere, and partly because of the Coral Sea and Midway operations that began to dominate Japanese naval planning. The window closed without being used, and this is one of the genuine might-have-beens of the Pacific War. The Indian Ocean Convoy System, protecting the sea routes from Aden and the Persian Gulf to India, from India to Australia, from East Africa to Suez, was maintained throughout the war with a quietness that belied its logistical importance. India was the primary staging ground for Allied operations in Burma, and the primary supplier of many of the raw materials that the British war economy required. The oil refineries at Aban in Iran were the single largest oil refinery installation in the world at the time, and their products moved by sea. If the Japanese had committed significant submarine forces to the Indian Ocean, and they did operate some submarines there, the disruption could have been serious. German submarines, too, made extended patrols into the Indian Ocean, particularly during the period of 1942 and 1943, when the Atlantic convoy routes were becoming increasingly hazardous. The Indian Ocean, with lighter escort coverage than the North Atlantic, offered German and Japanese submarines hunting grounds that were less contested than European waters. The Allied anti-submarine effort in the Indian Ocean was always stretched, always dependent on units that might have been employed elsewhere, and always conducting operations that were strategically essential without being operationally glamorous. The Eastern Fleet's gradual rebuilding from its East African nadir followed the general pattern of Allied naval reinforcement that the improving Atlantic situation and the growing American industrial output made possible. Modern carriers and battleships became available as American construction filled the gaps that combat losses had created in other theaters. By late 1943 and early 1944, Somerville's fleet had been reinforced sufficiently to begin offensive operations. Operation Cockpit in April 1944. A carrier strike on the Japanese-held port of Sabang on the northern tip of Sumatra was the first major offensive operation by the Eastern Fleet since the disasters of 1942. The strikes on Sabang and subsequent operations against Surabaya, Palembang, and other Japanese-held installations in the Dutch East Indies and Malaya were conducted with increasing confidence and effectiveness, and they served the purpose of demonstrating to the Americans, who were skeptical of British Pacific commitment, that the Royal Navy was capable of effective large-scale carrier operations. The argument over the British Pacific Fleet's operational role was, frankly, a political as much as a military question. Churchill was determined that Britain should participate visibly in the final defeat of Japan, partly for imperial prestige reasons. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and partly because he understood that the post-war Pacific settlement would be shaped by who had participated in the Pacific War. The Americans, particularly Admiral King, were distinctly cool about incorporating a British fleet, that would require American logistical support in a theater that the American Navy considered its own operational domain. King's resistance was partly practical. The forward basing requirements for British ships in the Pacific were real and substantial, and partly territorial in the institutional sense. The eventual agreement to form the British Pacific Fleet and operate it under MacArthur's overall command represented a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, but worked well enough operationally. The fleet was designated Task Force 57 and conducted extensive operations against Japanese airfields in the Sakishima Gunto Islands south of Okinawa, neutralizing air bases that would otherwise have been used to funnel aircraft into the Okinawa kamikaze campaign. The liberation of Burma and the final operations in the Bay of Bengal and along the Malayan coast in 1945 represented a different kind of naval effort. The close support of amphibious and riverine operations in a primarily land campaign. The Royal Indian Navy, the Royal Australian Navy's coastal forces, and the British fleet's landing craft flotillas all participated in operations along the Arakan coast and eventually in the amphibious landing at Rangoon, Operation Dracula, in May 1945. These were not glamorous fleet engagements. They were the grinding operational support work. Naval gunfire on Japanese defensive positions, landing craft running troops ashore on tidal beaches, minesweeping operations in river mouths, coastal bombardments to cover troop movements. The people doing this work knew they were in the secondary theatre, knew they were not going to be the subject of the famous photographs and the big histories. They did it anyway. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 requires specific examination because it was the most significant British military defeat of the war, and because its naval dimension is frequently underexplained. The loss of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse to Japanese land-based torpedo bombers on the 10th of December 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, removed the capital ship force that was supposed to deter Japanese seaborne invasion. The two ships were sent north from Singapore without air cover to intercept reported Japanese landings on the Malayan coast. They were found by Japanese land-based aircraft and attacked repeatedly. Prince of Wales was the newest battleship in the Royal Navy. She had carried Churchill to the Atlantic Charter meeting and had fought Bismarck. She sank with over 300 dead. Repulse sank with over 500 dead. The commander, Admiral Tom Phillips, went down with his flagship. Churchill's reaction on being told, "I was thankful to be alone. In all the war, I never received a more direct shock," was recorded in his memoirs. The loss confirmed definitively that capital ships without air cover were vulnerable to coordinated air attack. This conclusion had been available from the evidence of Pearl Harbor 3 days earlier, and from Taranto a year before that. The British made the same discovery in person. The Indian Ocean's significance in the broader Allied strategic picture becomes clearer when you consider what the theatre was protecting, rather than what it was actively fighting. The Persian Gulf oil supply to Britain and the Mediterranean moved through the Indian Ocean. Lend-lease supplies to the Soviet Union via the Persian Corridor, which eventually accounted for a significant share of total Allied supply to the USSR, transited the Indian Ocean. The garrison of India, from which the Burma campaign was supported, required seaborne supply. The entire economic life of Australia, which served as the primary base area for MacArthur's Southwest Pacific operations, depended on ocean routes protected by Australian and Allied naval forces. The Indian Ocean, in aggregate, was one of the most logistically important bodies of water on Earth during the war, and it was kept open at persistent cost and effort by forces that were chronically under-resourced relative to the importance of what they were protecting. The British Pacific Fleet's final operations in the waters off Japan in July and August of 1945. Carrier strikes on the Kure naval base, bombardments of the Japanese coast by British battleships, the final minesweeping and patrol operations were the culmination of the rebuilding journey that had begun in the tattered remnants of the Eastern Fleet retreating to Kilindini in Kenya in April 1942. The fleet that participated in those final operations was, by any measure, a formidable instrument. 4 fleet carriers, 1 battleship, 5 cruisers, 15 destroyers. It was not the equal of the American fast carrier force alongside which it operated, but it was a genuine fighting formation, capable of sustained offensive operations, flying competent pilots in adequate aircraft. It had come a long distance from Somerville's decision in April 1942 to avoid battle and survive to fight another day. The wisdom of that decision, the hard discipline of refusing an engagement you can't win, when survival itself is the strategic requirement, is a lesson that the British naval leadership learned in the Indian Ocean in 1942 and demonstrated it they understood by the performance of the Pacific Fleet 3 years later. Chapter 14: Iron Coffins and Broken Codes. The technology war beneath the surface. I want to do something slightly different in this chapter. Rather than following a chronological or geographical thread, I want to pull back and look at the technological and intelligence dimensions of the entire naval war as a continuous subject, because those dimensions cut across every theatre and every year, and understanding them changes how you read everything else. When a convoy arrives intact in Liverpool or Murmansk, the narrative reason might be a heroic escort commander or a favourable weather system or good seamanship by the merchant captains. But the technical reason might be that Bletchley Park read the U-boat patrol line positions 48 hours before the convoy reached them, and the routing officer sent the convoy north of the waiting submarines. The triumph and the tragedy of the naval war run on 2 tracks simultaneously: the visible, physical track of ships and aircraft and men, and the invisible track of ciphers, radar frequencies, acoustic signatures, and the mathematics of depth charge patterns. Both tracks are real. Both determined who lived and who didn't. The cavity. Magnetron, invented at the University of Birmingham in February 1940 by physicists John Randall and Harry Boot, deserves recognition as one of the most consequential pieces of hardware produced by any nation in the Second World War. The magnetron generated microwave radiation at centimetric wavelengths, which made possible the compact high-resolution radar sets that transformed anti-submarine warfare, night fighter operations, and naval surface search from approximately 1942 onward. The British shared the magnetron design with the United States in September of 1940 through the TIZAD mission, a transfer of British scientific secrets to American counterparts designed to accelerate American technological development. The American scientists involved in translating the magnetron into working production hardware, the physicists at the MIT Radiation Laboratory, compressed what might have been years of development into months. The resulting radar sets were fitted to aircraft and ships, and began changing the operational environment of the Battle of the Atlantic from mid-1942. A German U-boat commander who had felt reasonably safe, running on the surface at night, charging his batteries and transmitting operational reports, found, with no warning, that aircraft were appearing from the darkness before his Metox receiver had given any warning. German scientists investigated the phenomenon and proposed incorrectly that the Allied aircraft might be homing on the Metox receiver's own emissions. U-boat commanders were actually ordered to stop using Metox for a period. The truth that a fundamentally new radar technology was in use was not confirmed by German scientists until after the war. The Enigma cipher machine and its role in the naval war is a subject that has generated an enormous popular literature, some of it accurate, some of it badly distorted by dramatization. The core facts are these. The German military used the Enigma electromechanical cipher machine to encrypt operational communications across all services. The Polish Cipher Bureau had broken into early versions of the machine before the war and shared their methods and replicated machines with France and Britain in July of 1939. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, building on the Polish work, developed a combination of mathematical analysis and electromechanical computing. The bomb machines, and later Colossus, a genuine programmable electronic computer that could, under the right conditions, recover the daily settings of the machine and read the traffic. The naval Enigma was the hardest variance because the German Navy used additional procedures and, from February 1942, 4 rotors instead of 3. The periods when the naval Enigma was readable and the periods when it went dark, due to changes in procedures, addition of rotors, or the physical unavailability of captured key material, directly correlated with convoy loss rates. This is not a speculative relationship. It has been documented statistically by naval historians who have gone through the actual convoy records and the Bletchley Park archives simultaneously. The physical capture of Enigma materials was an intelligence operation conducted with a specific determination that produced results at significant human cost. The destroyer HMS Bulldog captured the German weather ship München in May 1941, obtaining cipher materials that gave Bletchley Park months of readable traffic. The capture of U-110 by HMS Bulldog, the same ship, the following week produced an actual Enigma machine along with code books and cipher tables. Lieutenant David Baum led the boarding party onto the sinking U-boat, recovering materials under conditions that required extraordinary composure. The German crew, believing their boat was sinking, had already abandoned ship. Balme went below into a submarine that might at any moment continue sinking, retrieved the cryptographic materials, and brought them to the surface. That physical capture, a young lieutenant on a boarding party in the North Atlantic in May of 1941, contributed directly to the breaking of the naval Enigma that same summer and to the routing successes that followed. The connection between that individual act of courage and the later reduction in convoy losses is not metaphorical. It is traceable. The American development of the proximity fuse, also designated the variable time fuse, or VT fuse, was a technological achievement in anti-aircraft warfare that deserves specific attention because it changed the mathematics of shooting down aircraft in a fundamental way. A conventional anti-aircraft shell required a direct hit or a timed fuse, set to explode at a specific altitude, both requiring accuracy that was extremely difficult to achieve against a maneuvering aircraft. The proximity fuse, fitted with a miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver, detonated the shell when it passed within lethal range of a target, typically around 10 meters, by detecting the change in the radio signal reflected from the target. The small size of the electronics required, housed in the nose of an artillery shell, represented a manufacturing challenge that required the industrial capacity of the American scientific establishment to solve. The fuse was tested operationally for the first time in January of 1942 by USS Helena against a Japanese aircraft, achieved a kill, and was progressively deployed across American anti-aircraft batteries. The marked increase in kill rates against kamikaze aircraft in the final year of the Pacific War, where conventional anti-aircraft fire had been demonstrably insufficient, owed a significant debt to the VT fuse. It wasn't the only improvement in the anti-kamikaze defense, but it was a measurable one. The development of operational research as a discipline, The application of mathematical and statistical analysis to operational military problems was one of the more consequential intellectual contributions to winning the naval war, and it came from civilians. The Admiral's Operational Research Section, the American Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group, and their equivalent bodies in other services applied statistical analysis to questions that military officers had previously answered by instinct and experience. How large should convoys be? The intuitive answer, smaller convoys are harder to find, was wrong. Mathematical analysis of convoy data showed that the number of attacking submarines that found a convoy was roughly independent of convoy size over a wide range. But the number of ships in the convoy that could be protected by a given number of escorts increased with convoy size. Larger convoys, properly escorted, were actually safer per ship than smaller convoys. This conclusion, reached by statistical analysis, contradicted naval intuition and was initially resisted. When it was eventually acted upon, it improved convoy survival rates. The history of operational research is the history of mathematics overcoming tradition. And in the Battle of the Atlantic, that process cost time and cost lives during the period when tradition was winning the argument. The Japanese naval signals intelligence failure is worth examining specifically because it illustrates what happens when an intelligence and cipher security program operates on the assumption that its own systems are unbreakable. The Imperial Japanese Navy used the cipher designated JN-25 for much of the war, a complex code that American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor and at the Combined Bureau in Melbourne were progressively breaking from early in the Pacific War. The intelligence derived from JN-25 provided the advance warning that allowed Nimitz to position his carriers northeast of Midway rather than at Pearl Harbor. And it provided the route information that allowed American P-38 fighters to intercept and shoot down the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto on the 18th of April, 1943. Japanese cipher security authorities investigated the Midway defeat and the Yamamoto ambush and reached inconclusive results in both cases. The Japanese continued using vulnerable cipher procedures. The Americans continued reading the traffic. The Yamamoto mission, Operation Vengeance, was specifically approved by the Secretary of the Navy because of the political weight of Yamamoto's symbolic importance. But it also demonstrated the willingness to spend specific intelligence, revealing, in effect, that the cipher was being read to anyone paying close enough attention for a specific operational result. Whether the operation was worth the potential compromise of the intelligence is a question that professionals in the intelligence community still debate. The development of high-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, pronounced HUFDUF, was an anti-submarine technology that worked on a different principle from radar and complemented it effectively. When a U-boat transmitted a radio signal, a contact report, a weather report, a status message, it radiated radio energy that could be detected and its bearing triangulated by shore-based or ship-based direction finding stations. The German U-boat operational doctrine developed by Dönitz required submarines to transmit regularly, particularly when in contact with a convoy. This radio discipline, essential for coordinating Wolfpack attacks, was the German Navy's most significant tactical vulnerability. The Allies built shore-based HFDF networks on both sides of the Atlantic, and from early 1942 began fitting shipborne HFDF sets to convoy escorts. A convoy escort fitted with HFDF could take a bearing on a transmitting U-boat, compare it with the bearing from another ship, and get a triangulated position. The escort commander could then send a ship down that bearing at high speed. The U-boat commander would not know he had been located. The first ship-fitted HFDF set was installed in a convoy escort, HMS Culver. in March 1941. It was not a perfect system, but combined with centimetric radar, ASDIC, and the increasing availability of air cover, it added another layer to the detection capability that was progressively closing down the U-boat's room for maneuver. The final technology I want to address in this chapter is the acoustic homing torpedo, developed by both sides in the later war period because it represents the point where the technological contest in the Battle of the Atlantic became its most sophisticated. The German Zaunkönig T5 acoustic homing torpedo, introduced in September of 1943, was designed to home on the propeller noise of convoy escorts, specifically to allow submarines to attack the destroyers and frigates that were their primary threat, rather than trying to get past them to the merchant ships. It was effective enough that its introduction caused immediate Allied casualties. In convoy battles in September of 1943, the T5 sank 3 escorts. The Allied countermeasure, developed with remarkable speed, was the Foxer, a noise-making device towed behind an escort at some distance astern that generated sufficient propeller-like noise to decoy the acoustic homing torpedo onto itself rather than the ship. The T5 had been in operational service for approximately 3 weeks before the Foxer was deployed to counter it. Both sides knew the counter had been deployed. The Germans worked on a torpedo that could discriminate between the Foxer and a real propeller. The Allies worked on a Foxer that the torpedo couldn't distinguish from a real ship. This was the technological war at its most granular. Move and counter-move, patent and counter-patent, physics and engineering competing at operational speed. Chapter 15. The Reckoning, Legacy, Cost, and what the naval war decided. I have been working toward this final chapter for several hours now, and I find that sitting with it requires a kind of deliberateness that the operational chapters didn't demand. The operational chapters had the internal logic of events. Things happened, then other things happened, and the connections between them were the subject of analysis. This chapter has a different requirement. It asks what it all meant, what it cost in full, and what the naval war decided that the land war and air war alone could not have decided. Those are harder questions, and I want to answer them with the same specificity I've tried to bring to the operational material, rather than retreating into generality. Start with the cost, because the cost is real and should be stated before anything else. The Battle of the Atlantic alone killed approximately 36,000 Allied merchant sailors, civilians, not combatants, men who signed on to ships because it was their profession and their livelihood, and because somebody had to move the cargo. The Royal Navy lost approximately 50,000 sailors killed over the course of the war. The United States Navy lost approximately 62,000 killed, a number that includes the Pacific and Atlantic theaters, and the shore installations, and the aircraft, and the submarines. The German Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm lost approximately 28,000 men, roughly 70% of those who served, a casualty rate that no other branch of any major service on any side in the war matched. The Japanese Navy lost approximately 419,000 men. These numbers are drawn from the best available post-war accounting, and they carry the caveat that wartime record-keeping was imperfect, that some losses were never formally documented, and that the real human cost was therefore almost certainly higher than the recorded figures. Each of those numbers was a person. Each was a family that got a notification or didn't, because some of these men simply disappeared into the ocean and were never formally listed at all. The ships, more than 5,000 Allied merchant vessels, were sunk during the war, totaling over 21 million tons of shipping. The United States alone built more than 2,700 Liberty ships during the war. Standardized cargo vessels constructed using prefabricated sections and welding, rather than riveting, with construction times that dropped from an average of 244 days in 1941 to an average of 42 days by 1943, as the production system achieved its full efficiency. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was famously assembled in 4 days and 15 and a half hours as a publicity demonstration. Though this was a record rather than a typical achievement, the industrial point stands regardless. American shipyards were building cargo ships faster than German U-boats could sink them by mid-1943, and that reversal of the tonnage equation was one of the structural reasons the Atlantic campaign went the way it did. Industrial capacity was strategy expressed in steel. The question of what the naval war decided is best answered by asking what would have happened without it. If the Battle of the Atlantic had gone the other way, if Dönitz had received his 300 submarines in 1939, if the centimetric radar had not been developed or shared, if the convoy system had not been fully implemented, if the signals intelligence effort had failed to break shark, Britain's supply lines would have been cut. Britain's industrial production depended on imported iron ore, oil, food, and raw materials. An island that cannot import cannot sustain industrial warfare. If the Atlantic supply line had failed in 1942, the American buildup in Britain that preceded D-Day could not have happened. The 8th Air Force could not have operated from British bases. The entire Allied strategy in Europe would have had to be reconsidered from the ground up. The naval war was not a supporting element of the Allied grand strategy. It was the precondition on which everything else depended. This is not a retroactive judgment. It was understood at the time. Churchill said in his memoirs that the only thing that genuinely frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. That assessment came from a man who had lived through the Blitz, Dunkirk, Singapore, Tobruk, and every other disaster the war had produced. He knew which threat came closest. In the Pacific, the naval war decided the shape of the post-war world in ways that are still legible today. Japan's strategic decision to attack Pearl Harbor was premised on the belief that the United States, once struck hard enough, would accept a negotiated settlement that preserved Japanese gains in East Asia. The decision was wrong, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, but it was not irrational given the assumptions that underlay it. What made those assumptions wrong was American industrial capacity and the specific character of the American public's response to Pearl Harbor. The United States didn't accept a settlement. It built a navy. It built, by the end of the war, by far the largest navy the world had ever seen. More than 1,200 major combat ships, including nearly 100 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, and approximately 500 destroyers. It deployed that navy across 2 oceans simultaneously, while fighting a land and air war in Europe. The industrial achievement behind those numbers, the shipyards, the factories, the training programs, the logistical infrastructure, was the deciding factor in the Pacific War, and it was a naval achievement in the most comprehensive sense of the word. The aircraft carrier, which entered the war as a promising but unproven weapon system operating in the shadow of the battleship, emerged from the war as the unambiguous capital ship of modern naval warfare. The battleship era, roughly the century and a half from Trafalgar to Pearl Harbor, in which large surface warships carrying heavy guns were the primary measure of naval power, ended in the first week of December 1941. Not metaphorically ended, actually ended in the sense that 2 separate incidents in 2 separate oceans in the same week demonstrated empirically that a battleship without air cover was simply a target. HMS Prince of Wales on the 10th of December, the battleships of Pearl Harbor on the 7th. After those events, no naval command of any major power could rationally organize its fleet around the primacy of the gun-armed surface ship. The carrier, with its mobile air power projection, had replaced it. The American fast carrier task forces of 1944 and 45, mobile, self-sustaining, capable of striking targets at ranges far beyond the horizon of any surface gun, were the model on which post-war naval power would be built. The USS Enterprise, CV-6, the Big E, the most decorated ship in American naval history, participating in more major actions than any other American vessel, was the living proof of that model. That she was eventually scrapped in 1958, despite a public campaign to preserve her, is one of the more unfortunate decisions in American naval heritage. The submarine, too, emerged from the war confirmed as a fundamental strategic weapon, rather than a coastal defense accessory. The German campaign demonstrated that submarines could, in sufficient numbers and with adequate tactical coordination, threaten the supply lines of a major industrial nation at an existential level. The American campaign demonstrated that submarines could systematically destroy an enemy's merchant and military shipping with an efficiency that directly undermined their ability to sustain a war economy. Both conclusions were absorbed by post-war naval planners, and the Cold War naval balance was built largely around the contest between submarine and anti-submarine capability. The nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarine on one side, and the anti-submarine warfare network on the other. The Cold War nuclear deterrent that shaped international relations for 45 years after 1945 was a submarine problem. And the submarine problem was understood through the prism of what submarines had done in the Second World War. The signals intelligence dimension of the naval war produced institutional consequences that were both immediate and extremely long-lasting. Bletchley Park's work, the combination of mathematical genius, engineering, innovation, and organizational intelligence that made the breaking of Enigma possible, was classified for decades after the war. The veterans of Hut 8 and its associated sections could not tell their families what they had done. The specific contribution of signals intelligence to Allied victory was not publicly acknowledged until the 1970s. When the full story emerged, it required a rewriting of the operational history of multiple campaigns, convoys that had been rerouted, U-boats that had been ambushed, admirals whose decisions were not the product of intuition, but of intelligence they couldn't attribute. The lesson drawn from this experience: that signals intelligence was a strategic asset of the First Order, and that protecting the source of that intelligence was worth accepting tactical costs to achieve, was built into the intelligence doctrine of every major Western power in the Cold War. The National Security Agency, GCHQ, the Five Eyes Partnership, all of these institutional descendants of wartime signals, intelligence drew directly on the organizational and technical experience of breaking naval codes between 1939 and 1945. The amphibious warfare capability that the Allied navies developed, beginning with the painful learning experiences of Operation Torch in November of 1942, and culminating in the Normandy landings of June 1944 and the Okinawa landings April 1945, produced a body of doctrine, equipment, and institutional knowledge that defined Western military power projection for the rest of the century. The landing ship tank, the landing craft vehicle personnel, the landing vehicle tracked, the naval gunfire support doctrine, the shorefire control party, the beach master organization, the naval combat and demolition units who cleared obstacles from beaches. All of these were developed, refined, and proven during the amphibious campaigns of the Second World War. Every American military intervention involving the landing of forces from the sea in the decades after 1945 drew on that institutional inheritance. The equipment changed, the doctrine evolved. The core principle That naval power could project military force onto defended coastlines at any point on the global littoral, was established as a permanent feature of Western military capability during the 6 years between September 1939 and September 1945. I want to come back at the end to something I said at the beginning. The sea doesn't preserve a battlefield. The sites of the Atlantic convoy battles are just ocean. The spot where Hood went down is just water. The coordinates where Yamato sank are indistinguishable from the surface from any other coordinates in the Western Pacific. The invisibility of these places is part of what makes the naval war hard to remember the way we remember Normandy or Stalingrad or Monte Cassino. You can't go and stand where it happened. You can read the records. You can hold the statistics. The 381 convoys, the 50,000 Royal Navy dead, the 28,000 U-boat dead. But the water doesn't help you the way a field does. The men who fought the naval war of 1939 to 1945. And I mean this for every side, because the young men in the U-boats were as truly young and as truly dead as the men in the corvettes above them, did their work in the hardest possible environment, and left almost no physical trace. Their memorial is the fact that the supply lines held, the fact that the oil came through, the fact that the tanks and the aircraft and the food and the ammunition arrived in the places they were needed, often barely in time, never with comfortable surplus. The entire land war in Europe and the Pacific was built on what those men did in the dark, in the cold, in the water, far from any shore. This has been the complete naval history of the Second World War. 15 chapters. I hope you came away from it with something you didn't have when you started. I hope specifically that you came away with an appreciation for the degree to which the naval war was the foundational war. The war beneath every other war, the campaign without which the campaigns on land could not have been fought. If you have questions, if you want to argue about any of it, if you think I underweighted the Soviet naval contribution, or the role of the Italian submarine force, or the specifics of the Guadalcanal destroyer battles, leave a comment. I will read it. I will probably argue back. That's what the history is for.